Chapter 21. Gwen sat cross-legged on her pallet on the floor, patiently braided her own hairs into a thread. A few threads and she could make a cord. If she had a cord, she might be able to strangle Medrote with it. There was not much else to do. She lived in a small room with a high window in one wall and a mattress heaped with furs on the floor. The floors were stone, the walls were stone, and the timbers of the ceiling could not be reached by any means from the floor. Without a knife, it was not possible to cut up the furs or the canvas cover of the mattress. She was wearing heavy woolen gowns of material too tough to tear and too closely woven to pick apart, without any fastenings or cords. She was barefoot. There was a heavy stone basin in the corner, with a hole much too small to stick anything down it, that was the latrine. The huge guard that brought her food sloshed a bucket of water down it when he came in. Medrote had gone to great lengths to make sure that there was nothing in here she could use as a weapon. Her food was served in a grass basket, and she ate it with her fingers. Her drink came in a blunted drinking horn that wouldn't serve as a weapon itself, and wouldn't smash to give her something with a point or edge. Those were taken away when she was finished, and the guard stayed there until she finished. This place, whatever it was, must have been built on the Roman style, for the floor was warm, though not nearly as warm as Arthur's palace. She was not sure how long she had been here, weeks, certainly, months, probably. For most of the early part of this ordeal she had been unconscious for long stretches, thanks to Medrote's potions. Medrote visited her from time to time. His visits were irregular, and the only way that she knew one was going to occur was when she began to feel dizzy after eating. He made sure that she couldn't move long before he unlocked her door. She had been completely unsuccessful in detecting whatever he was putting in her food. She'd tried not eating altogether, but eventually hunger drove her to eat. After all, it wasn't as if she wanted to die. That was the last thing she wanted. She wanted to get free. She was pretty certain that on the last several visits Medrote hadn't touched her, although she knew very well he had done whatever he liked early on. Probably he had found that lying with someone as unresponsive as a corpse was rather unsatisfying. Instead, of late, he had a chair brought, and sat in it, talking at her, until she lost consciousness. That might actually have not been so bad, if he had given her any real information. She knew far more than she wanted to know now about how he had gotten rid of Arthur's sons, how he had hoodwinked Arthur into trusting him, what most of his late childhood had been like, and far, far too much about how he had been certain she was destined for him from the moment he saw her. But there was a very, very strange thing that also happened when she was drugged, and sometimes when she was asleep. Visions, maybe. If visions they were, she could hardly credit them. But if they were not, why on earth would her mind have made such a thing up? She got glimpses into the life little Gwen was leading in her place, and at first everything happened as she would have predicted. Little Gwen absolutely revelled in her place as queen, wallowing in the baths and the preening, gossiping viciously with her ladies, and for mischief setting them against each other, ordering gown after sumptuous gown, and entertaining Arthur in her bed with a wanton abandon that made Gwen blush with shame. But then something happened. A new Arthur began to appear in that bedchamber of nights, an Arthur that she had never seen, a man who, despite his years, seemed more vibrant, more alive than she had ever seen him. And under the charismatic spell of that Arthur, little Gwen softened. Gradually she ceased tormenting her ladies. Gradually her demeanour took on a cast that Gwen couldn't really identify at first. And when she did, that was when she simply couldn't believe the dreams, because, if she was right, Arthur was taming the untamable little Gwen, winning her to him the way he won his men's hearts, and she simply could not believe that anyone as self-centered as little Gwen would come to care for anyone other than herself. She'd had another of those dreams last night. It seemed just as impossible as the ones before it. If she didn't know better, she would have thought that little Gwen was having second thoughts about betraying Arthur. Impossible. As she braided, she began to feel the tingling in her lips that signified he had slipped a potion into her again. With a resigned sigh, she thrust the thread she was braiding with the others she had made under the mattress, then stretched out under the furs and waited for the paralysis and Medrote to arrive. She stared up at the ceiling and the tiny bit of sky that was all that could be seen through the window. She was almost beginning to look forward to this. It made for a change in the endless sameness of her days. She had thought she was bored as Arthur's queen. Here she had nothing whatsoever to do except exercise, comb her fingers through her hair, and braid what came out. At least she was still fit. She did every exercise she could remember, practiced fighting moves even if she didn't have a weapon, stretched and flexed until she was more limber than she had ever been in her life, except as a small child. She had learned how to run and tumble in these wretched gowns, even if she couldn't run very far in the tiny cell. She even practiced that meditation that the ladies did, though she wasn't very good at it. She prayed a great deal. She recited what she could remember of bardic ballads and epics. She did that now, waiting for the potion to take effect, staring upwards, because when she couldn't move, she really didn't want to be frozen in a position where she had to look at Medrote. The room began to spin even though she was lying down. Beneath the furs, she tried, experimentally, to move her arm, and couldn't. So he should be entering at any moment. This was when she heard the bar on the outside of the door slide aside, and the door itself scraped open. Footsteps on the stone followed, as Medrote entered the room, followed by a servant with a comfortable chair, who left the chair and washed out the basin with a bucket of water. She could just see Medrote out of the corner of her eye. He made a face and waved a hand in front of his nose. "Time for another bath and a new gown, my love," he said. "You'll like that, won't you?" She felt a little sick inside. Yes, she liked being clean. No, she did not like the fact that it happened while she was unconscious. Not one bit. She would wake up with her hair washed and braided, completely scrubbed, and in a new clean gown. She had no idea who or what was doing this, nor what, if anything, happened besides the washing. What was the most disturbing, perhaps, was the level of detail. Her fingers and toes were neatly manicured, the nails trimmed, and even buffed to a soft polish. There were none of the perfumed oils of Arthur's baths, but there was a faintly pleasant scent on her skin afterwards. Any tiny abrasions or bruises were anointed with a balm, and calluses were sanded. "Well now, where were we?" Medrote asked rhetorically, since she couldn't answer. She turned her attention back to the ceiling. In a way, since she was forced to listen to these monologues, she was glad even her expression was frozen. At least he didn't know how revolted she was most of the time by his confidences. And why did he ever think that this would make her care for him? Maybe because Gwenhwyfar used to hang on his every word? "Ah, I don't believe I ever told you how Lot told me that I wasn't his." She heard him move a little as he settled himself in the chair. It was one of those rare moments when he was sulking about being Mother's panda, rather than gloating about it. Possibly his temper was because she was lying with someone he hadn't picked himself, and she wasn't allowing him to watch. So when I interrupted him to show him the results of the sacrifice and blood spell I had done all by myself, he knocked me into a wall and called me Arthur's unnatural bastard. At this point, likely, Gwenhwyfar had been cooing with sympathy to him. Oh, how she wished she could stop her ears! The images that his narrative called up made her feel even more ill. Her imagination, given what her visions had shown her of Anne Morgause and her past, created scenes of Medroth's mother disporting herself with a lover all too vividly. And it was hardly that she disapproved of love-making, though her own experiences were not inclined to make her crave it herself. It was how Anne Morgause had used it, as a tool, a weapon. Even with Arthur, especially with Arthur. I knew better than to move. Lot is entirely unpredictable, and there was no telling how he would react. He glared at me a moment, then stormed off. I went to ask Morgana what he meant. Gwen couldn't turn her head to see his expression, but his tone was casual, as if he was telling a tale about someone else. This had probably hurt him, yes, even him, if it was true. If. There was no telling with Medroth. Perhaps the reason for his casual tone was that it actually had never happened at all. She told me that what Lot had said was entirely true, even the unnatural part. He chuckled. She explained it all to me, that Mother was Arthur's half-sister, and that even though the gods themselves often mated with their siblings, or daughter with father and son with mother, small-minded mortals thought this was wrong. A very enlightened woman is Morgana. None of that really mattered to me either. His voice took on a faint tone of gloating. Now this she could believe. Very little mattered to Medroth, so long as he got what he wanted. All that did matter was that Lot, who I hated and despised, even at so young an age, was not my father. My real father was the man who was king over Lot, who had the folk of Anwin as his allies, and the Merlin as his servant. My real father was Arthur, the High King. What Lot intended to be the moment of my humiliation became the moment of my release and elevation. That was the moment that I knew that I was destined for great things. I would either create something unparalleled, or destroy it. Either way, my name would never be forgotten. She would have shivered at his words if she had been able to move. She believed this, too, believed fervently that Medroth hated Lot and Lot hated him, and that Medroth craved fame or infamy and didn't care which he got, so long as he had it. Mother sensed that I had learned the truth and questioned me about it. I told her, but only in Morgana's presence, because I wanted Morgana to know I had told, and I wanted Mother to know that we were together on this. He let out his breath in a long sigh of reminiscence. Mother was always a little afraid of Morgana, and I didn't know why at the time, but I felt that with Morgana there, she wouldn't dare punish either of us. I found out later, of course, just why Mother feared her. Morgana had pledged herself to the Morrigan when her woman's blood first began to flow. That meant nothing to her, well, except that if Anne Morgause was wary about this Morrigan, it would be wise to be even more wary. He laughed, softly, mockingly. "You're puzzled, of course. You wouldn't know of the Morrigan. She is the dark of the moon to Ceridwen's full moon. They know her well in Era, though, and it was a wise woman of Era that taught our Morgana of her. She is the chooser of the dead, the storm-crow, the washer at the ford. She is power and chaos, and she suits our Morgana most perfectly. Even Mother was afraid of the Morrigan's power." Gwen felt a cold that had nothing to do with the potions or her paralysis. It wasn't wise to mix with the gods, the dark ones in particular. Lot himself has always left Morgana alone, even though he lusts for her to this day. I often wonder if that wasn't why Morgana pledged herself in the first place. Well, Gwen couldn't fault Morgana for protecting herself from Lot, whose excesses rivaled those of his wife. But dealing with the dark side of the moon goddess, risky, risky business. Everyone knew there were always two sides to every power, but dealing even with the bright side of the changeable goddess of the moon was a great deal like trying to bargain with the folk of Annwn. Ceridwen was fickle enough. What was the Morrigan like? It wasn't wise to put a name to the Dark Ones, nor to give your name to them, and even more foolish to bargain with them. Not unless you wanted them to come for you one day, asking a payment much too high for what you got. It did rather sound as if that was exactly what Morgana wanted.
So Mother didn't argue with Morgana. She didn't even chide her. She just said, "Since you have told him, you might as well have the teaching of him." And that was what she did.
Gwen heard him get up from his chair and walk over to her pallet to peer down at her. The ceiling seemed to move in a slow circle, with his face at the center of it.
"Ah, still with me. Good. It is really quite important that you hear this, my love. You need to understand just why it's futile to resist me, and important to love me."
He sat back down in his chair, satisfied that she was still listening to him.
"Naturally, Morgana told me everything then, not the least of which was how the Merlin had tried to have me killed when I was born. Morgana had seen just this thing in her scrying, and had told Mother, so Mother had made certain I was safe by giving birth early. By that, Morgana was as much my mother as she was, if not more. Well, when she told me that, I was all for pledging to the Morrigan myself. Unfortunately, the Morrigan does not accept males."
He sighed theatrically.
"Nevertheless, Morgana taught me and kept me safe from my brothers until I could defend myself. It was shortly after that Mother decided that it would be a fine idea to wed Morgana to your father. She had intended him for herself, but her magics were thwarted."
Oh, Gwen remembered that all too well.
"Now, I would imagine at this point you are wondering why Morgana didn't ensnare your father. She was more powerful than Mother, and the moon goddesses, bright and dark, are goddesses of passion and love. It's a logical question." The chair creaked as Medrote leaned back in it. "The answer is simple enough. She didn't want him. Why would she? He was an old man, more than old enough to be her father."
After a pause he began to laugh, harder and harder, the sound filling up the entire room, battering her ears. After what seemed like far too long, his laughter died down.
"Oh my, that was funny. You should be able to understand her feelings perfectly, my love. After all, you are married to an old man who is more than old enough to be your father."
As Gwen teetered on the edge of unconsciousness, it came to her in a last moment of pure nausea that, for once, Medrote was right. She did understand Morgana's feelings in that, if nothing else. She understood them perfectly. Gwen awoke, as usual, slowly. But as she woke, she was aware almost immediately that she was not where she expected to be. Scent came to her first, and the scent was of steam and soap with a touch of rosemary. Then came the sense of hard pressure at her back, not the soft mattress, and there was no weight of furs on her either. It was warm, extremely warm. As sensation came back to her fingers, she flexed them and ran them over the surface she was lying on. Wood. There was no wood in her cell, except the beams of the ceiling. She fought against the clinging hold of the potion, struggled to free herself of it, feeling hope begin to stir. She had to see where she was. Finally she got her eyes open and looked up at the ceiling above her. It was tiled in blue mosaic, and although it was not tiled in a pattern she recognized, she knew very well what this must be: a Roman bathhouse in a Roman or Roman-styled villa. She was where she was always groomed while she was unconscious. Only this time, for some reason, she was alone. These rooms echoed dreadfully. If there had been anyone else here, she would have heard the breathing, even if they didn't stir. So, alone, and somewhere other than her cell. Hope took on strength. By this time she knew exactly how soon she could move as the potion wore off. She was nearly on fire with impatience, until at last she was able to sit up. She had been lying on a wooden bench, very near a small soaking pool, smaller than the one she knew in Arthur's villa. This definitely was a Roman bathhouse, for the entire interior was paved in mosaic, blue with scenes of mermaids on the walls, brown with plants on the floor and in the pool. Her hair was still damp and a bit heavy, but not soaking, so someone had been drying it before she had been abandoned. She was in a chemise, but not a gown, though there was a clean one nearby. There were, in fact, a great many things nearby, including a knife that someone must have been using to clean and trim her nails. It wasn't a big knife, but it was more of a weapon than she had seen in far too long. With her eyes fixed on it, she held her breath and listened. There was a lot of commotion going on in the far distance. Shouting, fighting. Something urgent had interrupted the people grooming her and kept them occupied long enough for the potion to wear off. If that was fighting, they might even have forgotten her. At some point, though, someone would realize that they had been gone too long. She had to act, and act quickly. The first thing she did was to don the gown, slit it up the middle, and use strips she cut from the towels she found to bind the result to her legs like a pair of trews. She followed that by making crude cloth shoes with the remains of the towels. Once she would have been able to go barefoot in anything but snow. No more. And if she managed to escape, she couldn't afford damaged feet. She braided her hair roughly, tied the end with a bit of scrap, then hunted quickly for what else might be useful. She took what was left of the towels, the knife and the pumice stone she found there, and a dipper, shoving everything but the knife into a small wooden bucket. She didn't have the time or the strength to break up the bench to get a club, but she could swing the bucket to bash someone with and use the knife. The only entrance into this room probably led to the changing room. She eased towards the doorway and peered cautiously through it. The next room, also paved and walled in mosaic like the first, was empty, and unfortunately there was nothing useful there in the way of clothing or a weapon. There were 2 more doors into the changing room. She could not afford to take the wrong one, lose time, possibly be trapped in the one with the cold bath in it. She listened again, going over how a bathhouse was laid out in her mind. There would be at least one room that had a cold bath in it, but any sound would be coming from the doorway that led to the rest of the building. That way. What she wanted was the quickest way outside, one that didn't pass any more rooms. Granted, she didn't have much in the way of resources, but stopping to try and steal anything would only increase the risk of being caught. She moved quickly to the corridor. Here the mosaic continued only on the floor. The walls were plaster, painted with fading scenes of Roman gods and creatures of story. The cloth wrapped around her feet muffled her footsteps and allowed her to move in complete silence. She listened intently as she moved, and kept a sharp watch for places she might be able to hide if anyone came along this corridor. But no doors gave out onto it, except the one at the end, and the only light came from slit windows high up under the ceiling. The noise was all coming, so far as she could tell, from the opposite side of the villa, and to her delirious joy, the corridor she was in gave out not on a courtyard, but onto a bit of gravelled yard, surrounded by a laid stone wall. And in the centre of the yard was a pile of wood, a chopping block and an axe left stuck in the block, as if the user had been interrupted. This was the yard that supplied the hypercaust with wood. With that in her hand, it would take more than 2 or 3 men to make her a captive again. She ran out into the yard, seeing the mouth of the furnace in the wall to her right as she did so. She shoved the knife in the bucket, grabbed the axe and yanked it out. The wall had been built to keep people out, not in. There was a rough way up to it by way of the wood stacked against it, and she took it, flinging herself flat on the top of it to avoid being seen. The wall was built at the top of a steep slope, with woods at the bottom. It was a long way down to the ground, but this height was nothing she hadn't managed before, so long as she remembered how to fall and tumble. The building she had just left loomed higher than the wall. There was no way to tell what all the ruckus was about. She just hoped it would continue. Breathing a prayer to Epona, she tipped herself feet first over the edge, axe in one hand, bucket in the other. She hit hard enough to hurt, but not hard enough to break or sprain her ankles, and she turned the fall into a barely controlled tumble and let the momentum hurtle her down the slope at a pace far faster than she could have run. This came at a cost, of course. Stones hidden in the long, rank grasses bruised her ribs as she rolled over them, and she collided abruptly with a tree trunk at the bottom. But still, nothing broke, and she was able to scramble to her feet and duck into the woods. She felt as if she was on fire with exultation. She was free. Free, yes, but the trick is to stay free. She paused, panting, to take stock of her situation. All right, I have no idea of where I am, or when. It could be early spring or autumn. The trees were leafless, but buds on the branches of the bushes that screened her were greening. Spring, then. She had been Medrote's captive for most of the winter. She didn't know where she was, and there was no way to find out quickly, or slowly, for that matter. Assuming she got away, far away, and encountered farmers or a village, she didn't dare ask anyone, for as soon as it was known that she had escaped, Medrote would have his men out looking for her. Think, girl. East was dangerous. South was the Saxons, north was Lot's. All right, no matter where I am, if I go west, eventually I will come to our lands, or at least the lands of Father's allies. All she had to do was figure out just which way was west. But first she had to put as much distance between her and that villa as possible, and for that, the best answer was to travel directly away from it, no matter which direction that was. Bucket in one hand, axe in the other, she made herself think calmly and gathered all of her scouting skills together. Then she slipped into the forest like a phantom. Those scouting skills returned with every step she took, until she was slipping through the woods as silently as any deer and leaving less trace. Perversely, the fact that her feet were wrapped in rags meant that she left almost no footprints, and the little she left was unrecognizable as human. Every time she came to a stream, she waded into it and walked along it for as long as her feet could take the cold. She never went in the same direction twice either, going upstream on one or downstream on the next. So when she heard the hounds behind her, and then heard their baying turn to bafflement, she knew she had bought herself at least a little more time. But if they got downwind of her, they would find her without finding her trail, so she needed to either get downwind of them, or get something between herself and them that could confuse the scent. She was hoping for a nice swamp, or some other pungent way to break her trail, when she realized that there were some sort of animals in the woods ahead of her, for she heard slow footsteps and the occasionally breaking twigs. She froze as she heard snuffling, then relaxed as she recognized the sound for a herd of deer, rather than the vastly more dangerous herd of swine. She altered her course to find them, pushing through more underbrush until she surmounted the top of a little ridge, crouching to keep from making a human silhouette that would spook them. When she did spy the herd, grazing on twig ends, she realized she had made a mistake, but a fortunate one. Not deer, goats. This was much, much better than deer. Probably the fighting had driven them away from their usual pasture, and their pungent smell would surely cover her scent, and they should be used to human beings. There were about 20 of them, brown and grey, still shaggy with their winter coats. Cautiously, she stood up. They looked at her calmly, the sure sign that they were not feral. With a grin she walked towards them and clucked at them. "Come on," she whispered, making a little shooing motion. "We need to go, you and I. There are dogs coming, and you don't like them any better than I do." The lead goat looked at her with his strange goat eyes, snorted, and stamped his foot. The other goats all looked up at him and stopped eating. He bobbed his head, then led the herd off in the direction she wanted. They let her get right in among them. She began to wonder after a few moments if this was something more than an ordinary goat herd. Because not only were they going the way she wanted to, but very soon the leader was taking them at quite a brisk pace, and the rest were not protesting at all, nor trying to stop to graze. He took them to a track that was wide enough that she wasn't being slapped by underbrush, and kept them on it. She was able to trot along in the middle of them, quite as if they had accepted her as one of them. Even as she thought that, the leader turned his head over his shoulder and looked at her. There was a green flash as his yellow eyes, with their kidney-shaped pupils, became laughing green eyes. There was a shiver of power, and she almost stopped dead in her tracks at the shock. Then they became goat eyes again, and the he-goat continued shoving his way through the underbrush beside the path. She hurried to keep up with them. "The cathal dweir," she thought to herself. The water horses sometimes took on the aspect of other hooved animals than the horse. The green eyes were a good clue as to what they were, and so was the fact that this path they were on was never very far from a stream. As they pressed on, he increased the pace again, until they were trotting, and she was really stretching her legs. It had to be a long time since she'd walked this far. Her legs started to hurt. Ah, gods! If only he would be a horse, so I could ride! But she knew that was impossible, for he would be keeping his distance from her because of the iron axe and knife, and she dared not abandon the only weapons she had. "But thank you," she called softly. The he-goat bobbed his head, but did not look back at her again. Behind them, the sound of the dogs faded with distance, then died away. If they hadn't lost the trail before she joined the water horses, they surely had now. Her side ached. She pressed her elbow into it and kept up. "He could be taking me to the other world." That was a risk she would have to take. Anwen was a dangerous place for mortals, and the water horses were not often known for having kindly natures. There was no telling what else she might meet there, either. But she thought she could probably keep herself safe as long as she kept her wits about her. At this point, yes, Anwen was much to be preferred over being in Medrote's hands. The goats pushed on, and she held her aching side and ran with them. Wherever they were going, one thing was sure: it was away from Medrote. Chapter 22. The goats finally stopped in the last blue glow of twilight at the edge of a lake. Stopped and then plunged in. They didn't stop either, nor did they swim. They ducked beneath the still, cool surface with hardly a splash at all, and didn't emerge again. Gwen found herself quite alone, except for a fluttering in the reeds of birds and the distant mutter of ducks. Gwen was not at all surprised at their sudden abandonment of her. Exhausted, yes, but not surprised. The Cefildwyr, like all the folk of Anwen, were fickle and quite easily lost interest in the plight of mortals. It was wiser, when you got aid from them, not to count too much on it, and never to expect anything further. So here she was, on the edge of a lake, with nothing more than the clothing on her back, the axe, and the contents of her bucket. In the dark, hungry, and with a raging thirst. All right, things were not so bad. Though she was hungry, she had been eating well in captivity. A few days without food would do her no harm, and a single night was negligible. She had water, right here at her feet. She could find some place to hide in order to sleep, even in the dark, and if the moon came up, well, all the better. The important thing was that she was free, and the water horses had made sure that Medrote would have a wretched hard time trying to track her. Even though he had hair of hers to do so magically, being so muddled up with the water-horse magic might well be enough to throw him off the scent there, too, for a while. While she could still see, she bundled the knife in the left-over strips of toweling, then got herself a bucket full of water. The dipper made a fine cup, and she drank until she was sated, then sat down and waited to see what sort of moon would rise. To her great joy it was full. The sight of the pale orb lifting slowly above the trees made her breathe a sigh of intense relief. She would easily be able to see now, to get into what was probably the single safest place to sleep, unless she found an old den to hide in, tied into the crotch of a tree as far above the ground as she could manage. The light painted a swath of silver across the lake and touched the wisps of mist that were just beginning to rise from the waters. In the morning, well, there were a lot of things that she could do to find food. There were edible roots, and if she could manage to make a line, she could certainly fish. The axe was a comfort to have, but it was the sharp little knife that was going to make all the difference to her survival. She gathered up her things and began a prowl of the lake shore, and within moments found exactly what she needed in the form of an ancient tree, uprooted by a winter storm, lying half in, half out of the water. She explored the trunk, pulling brush that had piled up against it aside, and uncovered a hollow beneath it that was just big enough to hold her, full of dead leaves blown in by the winds. She shoved her possessions in as far as they would go, and crawled in after, pulling the brush back across the opening. The leaves crackled and gave off a little bitter smell, which should further serve to mask her scent. It appeared that the water-horses hadn't abandoned her after all, since this shelter was no more than 50 paces from where they had left her on the shore. For the first time since she had stormed into Arthur's chambers, she smiled. Triumph tempered with caution made her spirits rise. She had done it. She had escaped, and although she'd had some help in getting away, and had certainly benefited by good luck, she was the one that had rescued herself. That triumph eased the aches of overused and too-tired muscles, warmed her all over, and finally let her ease down into the first real sleep she had had since she left Castell y Llwchlas. It was the sound of a small wren peeping inquisitively not a foot from her ear that woke her. She knew exactly where she was. A warrior got into the habit of waking with full knowledge fairly quickly, and it wasn't one that was easily lost. The sound of the bird was reassuring. If anyone or anything had been snooping about, that bird would not have been poking through the brush that hid her sleeping spot. She stayed right where she was, though. She could not afford a single wrong step out here. Her resources were too thin to allow for mistakes, and even though she had a head start on those hunting her, they had the advantage of numbers and mobility. She had no time at all to waste. Everything must be carefully planned. She needed food. It was too early for berries, Finding a cache of nuts was chancy, and she didn't want to wait here to see if she could snare rabbits. Roots were possible, especially those of water plants, but the best idea was to fish. In the spring, fish were hungry. The best use of that toweling was to make a fishing line. She could carve a hook easily enough, and a bit of twig would serve as a bobber. She knew exactly where to dig for grubs and worms. So, unravel a long woof thread from the toweling, make a hook, get bait, fish. That was the first order of the day. Next, try and find a flint or other sparking stone. They were often enough found among the pebbles in streams and lake beds. She had the axe. She could make a fire if she could find a piece of flint. Cautiously, she pushed the brush out of the way and took a careful look around before emerging into the dawn. By the time the sun was overhead, she was full of fish. She had a hook and line, a flint, and had even found a way to sew the shoes together, padding the bottoms for a little more protection. They were only cloth, they wouldn't last long, but she only needed them to last until she managed a better substitute, or found someone she could trust, or stole something. With more cooked fish, cress, and some baked cattail and mallow roots in the bottom of her bucket, protected by a bit of cloth, she headed west. She was very glad now that she had taken the bucket. It was proving as useful as the knife. It now held food, dry tinder, and the flint she had found among the stones at the lake shore, as well as the rest of her meagre belongings. The water horses had not made another appearance, and she assumed they had either forgotten her or had given her all the help they were inclined to. So before she left the lake, she had left 3 nicely cooked fish and some baked cattail roots on a rock beside the water by way of a thank-you gift. As she cautiously threaded her way through the forest, using streams as often as possible to keep her trail broken, she made a mental inventory of things she wanted. Real shoes and real trews were both high on the list, and so was a bow. She tried very hard not to think too hard about the fact that she had no idea where she was. She was a scout, and an expert one at that. She knew all of the signs that showed where people were, and the farther she got from Medroat's villa, the more likely it was that it would be safe to approach them. She also kept her eyes open for anything edible, and gleaned some early mushrooms and a squirrel's cache of nuts that way. It was not until she found another good place for a camp, this one a hollowed-out but still standing tree, had set several snares made with more ravelled thread from her towels, had eaten and made herself comfortable for the night, that she realized something. Even though this was real hardship, and was only going to get harder, she didn't care how long it took to find her way to friends. For the first time in her life she was free. There were no demands, no duties she was obliged to perform. She answered to no one out here, and her own skills and her own 2 hands were enough to keep her fed and safe. As she restlessly shifted, finding a comfortable position in the hollow she had scooped dry in the rotted wood, the inescapable thought came to her, "What if I never went back?" She immediately scolded herself for the impractical, if nothing else. She was well enough equipped to stay healthy and fed in the spring and summer, but winter would surely kill her. She did not have enough in the way of protection or hunting gear to survive even a mild winter. But what if she could find a way to live out here, never go back to Arthur? And for just one heady moment she entertained a daydream of complete freedom. Perhaps she could find an old hermit's hut. She wouldn't need much. If she were settled, she could spend her time hunting and tanning the hides of what she caught. She pictured herself making serviceable garments from rabbit hide, then making a crude bow, bringing down deer, living out a life with no obligations to anyone but herself. She sighed, the fantasy dissolving almost as quickly as she had conceived of it. I'd go mad. Although she liked her own company well enough, she knew she was not the sort for a hermit's life. And aside from all that, Gwenhwyfar was masquerading as her, and that could have no good ending, not for Arthur, and not for anyone else either. She had to get back and expose the treacherous bitch. Medrote had had a very long time to plan whatever it was he was going to do, and he probably would not have kidnapped her if his plans weren't close to fruition. She owed Arthur that. The weight of duty and responsibility descended on her again, as if someone had piled heavy stones on her heart, and she cried, just a little, as she settled in for sleep. After 2 days of almost direct westward movement, Gwen relaxed a little and began to look for signs of human beings. While it was true that Medrote's control extended this far, practically speaking, she didn't think he was all that interested in anything that went past the immediate boundaries of his villa. Medrote was at heart disinclined to trust anyone but himself. Governing land required a great deal of work he couldn't perform if he wasn't physically present. She had the feeling that the reason he had, as time passed, left her alone for so long was because he was still cultivating his place as one of the king's companions. The work her father did on a day-to-day basis meant he was always dealing with his chiefs and nobles, sometimes over details as small as the harvest from an individual farm. Medrote couldn't possibly oversee extensive property himself, yet it was work he would never trust to anyone else. So the villa was probably just a remote hideaway, and one with no village, no farms, nothing that belonged to it that was outside its walls. And while Medrote could probably force or bully cooperation from those living near the place, it was unlikely he even bothered to try to rule anyone living more than a day's ride away. She began listening carefully for the distant sounds that would tell her there was human habitation: the crow of a rooster, the sound of a dog barking, the echo of an axe on wood. But the faint sounds she heard first were nothing so peaceful. They were the metal-on-metal clash of swords, faint, far, but not all that far away. And she didn't even think, she reacted. She ran towards the sounds, aided by the fact that the game trail she was on went in the same direction. Whoever was fighting, the odds were good that one side or the other would be friendly to her. The brief pang of regret that her strange idyll of freedom was over was lost in the fierce wash of glee that at last, at long last, she was going to be able to strike back at someone. But as she stopped just before the clearing, where 4 men were being held off by a single incredibly skillful fighter, she froze in shock for a moment. She knew that fighter. It was Lancelin, with his back up against the trunk of an enormous tree so that they couldn't ring him, and from the look of things he was tiring. She didn't recognize the 4 men who were clearly trying to kill him, but they were well clothed and well armed, and the odds were good that they were Medrotes. She assessed all this in no time at all, dropped her bucket, picked her target, and leapt to Lancelin's aid, axe held in both hands as she raced in for a killing stroke before they realized she was there. She aimed not for the body, which might be protected by riveted metal plates inside the jerkin, but for the back of the man's neck, where the helm ended. She couldn't see his neck beneath the hair, but she didn't need to. She knew there was no protection there. She hit that spot with all her momentum and all her strength. The axe struck home against bone. The handle shivered in her hands as the axe head severed the spine and went halfway into his neck. It lodged in there, but she had already let go of it and was reaching for the sword his powerless hand dropped. As if she had practiced the move 100,000 times, she snatched it out of mid-air, and throwing herself into a half-spin, slammed the flat of the blade into the belly of the man that had been next to him. She hadn't enough time to hit him with the edge, but she didn't need to. She just needed to buy time for a better attack. As she had expected, there was metal under the leather, but she knocked the breath out of him and drove him back a little. and the shock and surprise of her appearance had given Lancelin the opening to drive his own sword into a third man's throat. That man went down with a strangled gurgle. Now the odds were 2 to 2. The two men left glanced at each other, shocked. Lancelin and Gwen didn't pause even for a heartbeat. As if they were linked together, they both acted and grabbed the moment of that glance to attack. And in the time it took to draw a quick breath, the second pair was down. Lancelin's from a thrust into his eye, Gwen's from a deadly and accurate swing at his legs, where he wasn't armored. There were great advantages to being shorter than your enemy sometimes. She spun again, this time able to aim, and took him across the back of his legs at the knee. Her man went down, too shocked to scream, hamstrung. And in the next instant, Gwen stepped on his sword arm, keeping him pinned, while Lance put a foot on his chest and a sword point at his throat. She reached down and wrenched the sword out of his hand.
"Whose men are you?" the companion panted. "What do you want?"
"Medroot's," the man gasped. "He sent us to hunt for her." Lancelin looked at Gwen, his mouth a thin, grim line. She nodded. They had no way to keep this man prisoner without risking themselves, and to let him go would be suicide. Granted, he was hamstrung, but it was possible he would be found. And if he wasn't found, they would be leaving him to die slowly and painfully. Lancelin thrust the sword home, removing the risk. Then he collapsed back against the trunk of the tree, spent. Wordlessly, she went back for her precious bucket, emptied the contents out beside him, and went in search of water. He might as well eat the food that was in there. It wouldn't keep much longer. Water was never very far away here, wherever here was. She found a stream quite soon and filled the bucket. When she returned with it, he was no longer alone, although his company was not human. The horse had a familiar look to it, and she was fairly certain it was of her father's breeding, and it was clearly his, since it was nuzzling him as he fed it bits of her baked mallow root. She put the bucket down beside him. He didn't bother with the dipper, just picked the whole thing up and poured the water down his throat. Only after he had drunk half the bucket and poured the rest over his head did he finally say something.
"You are the real Gwenhwyfar," he said, in a tone of weary satisfaction. "You could only be the real one."
"The false one can't fight," she said wryly, sitting on her heels beside him. "She prefers that unpleasant things are all taken care of for her, preferably where she can't see the unpleasantness and can pretend it is not happening. Are you injured?"
"Bruises aplenty. Maybe a cracked rib. Those chills might have had horses somewhere about, though they attacked me afoot when I stopped to let Idris graze for a bit."
He tried to stand up and winced. She got back to her feet. "Stay there. I'll have a look about for them, but don't hope too much. I don't think Medroot lets too many of his men have anything as costly as a horse." A brief look didn't turn up any horses, nor any sign of them. She wasn't surprised. Even afoot, they'd had plenty of time to get ahead of her. They hadn't needed to stop to fish and cook and try to make some makeshift equipment for themselves. When she came back to him, he'd gotten his armor off, and he looked as if he'd been put in a barrel full of stones and rolled downhill in it. But he wasn't cut anywhere significant. A shallow gash across the ribs, a couple across the backs of his hands, and another over one eye. And careful probing proved that he hadn't actually cracked his ribs. So now she asked the question that had been burning on her tongue. "Were you looking for me?" He nodded.
"When we came back from trouncing the Saxons with Arthur, the Queen, the false one, didn't seem right. She looked like you, but there were too many things that weren't like you. At least not to someone who'd fought beside you." He grimaced. "This will sound rude."
"So be rude," she replied. We've fought together, and more than once."
She was too womanly. He glanced at her apologetically. "I don't mean that you are not womanly, but she was like the king's second wife. She revelled in luxury. You were indifferent to it. At least it seemed that way to me. She spent hours in the bath. When she wasn't in the bath, she was fussing over gowns and hair, and when she wasn't doing that, she was all over Arthur like a camp whore." He said that last without thinking, then flushed a deep crimson, glancing at her. But she just nodded grimly. "She's my sister," she replied around clenched teeth. "Schooled by Anna Morgause and Morgana, and Anna Morgause was insatiable. Those weren't just rumours you heard about her legion of lovers, they were facts. We called her Gwenhwyfar, Little Gwen. She's married to Medrote." He blinked at that, and blinked again. "But—" She snorted. "Oh, Medrote is perfectly happy to have her where she is. He may think he's nothing like Lot, but he has no trouble playing his wife's pander. The only difference is that he does it for power, not pleasure. He has several plans afoot to be made Arthur's successor, and he's using Gwenhwyfar to open the door for him." Lancelin's mouth made a shocked little O. Then he cleared his throat self-consciously and continued. "I couldn't get anywhere near to her, of course. And Arthur, well, Arthur was rather pleased." He flushed again. "He said now and then that his wife must have missed him a very great deal." "Arthur is a man," she said dryly. He coughed. "Yes, well, the thing is, Gildas turned up around midwinter, and she acted as if she had never seen him before, and when he tried to converse with her, she just turned him away. Arthur wouldn't hear that there was anything wrong, of course." He coughed again. "So Gildas talked to a few of us that knew you. Asked us to try and find out what was going on. If maybe the queen had been possessed or enchanted or— Well, then he had another idea. Gwenhwyfar, this sounded mad to me at the time. He asked if maybe it wasn't you at all. He pointed out that the Merlin had enchanted Uther to appear as Igraine's husband, and that was how Arthur was conceived in the first place. He thought that maybe someone had enchanted another woman to look like you." She blinked at that because it was so near the truth. Gildas was a great deal more observant and more clever than she had thought. "And you thought?" "I knew something was wrong. That queen wasn't the warrior I knew. Her hands were smooth and fair, and she was—" he groped for words. "She was petty. Instead of wanting to know about King March's schemes, or what the Saxons were about, or even peaceful things like the state of the harvest, she only seemed to care about gowns and gems and how to be amused. So I watched her, and saw that she stole away now and again to speak privily with Medrote. I told that to Gildas, who suggested that the next time Medrote went on one of his excursions from court, I should follow him to find out where he went. So I did. Then I went to the Isle of Glass, and told him about Medrote's villa. And the next thing I knew, Gildas had rounded up some of his monks, and gone trotting off to see what Medrote was up to." She stared at him for a moment, then began to laugh, because she could all too easily imagine Gildas doing just that, trusting in his God to keep him safe. And then she laughed even harder, because she knew now what it was that had caused the commotion that allowed her escape. It had to have been Gildas, pounding on the gate, demanding hospitality, which Medrote would not at all have been willing to give him, but which he would have known he had to. Lancelin looked at her as if he was afraid she had gone mad, until she explained why she was laughing. "He must have been the one that distracted everyone, so I could get away." She sketched in something of what her captivity had been like, and her escape. She left out the part about being fairly sure
Medrode had amused himself with her unconscious body until that paled on him. It would probably only make him angry, and in the long run... In the long run, there isn't much difference between how I feel about Arthur's using me and how I feel about Medrode doing the same. Horrible, but true, which was something Lancelin, who adored Arthur, did not need to know.
It must have been Gildas, the brave fool.
He smiled a little.
I was a day or two behind him. He set off so suddenly, and I am ashamed to say I stupidly assumed no one would attack someone as well armed and armoured as I am.
He shook his head ruefully, and a lock of hair fell into his eyes. He brushed it away.
And then you came to the rescue. This is a rather inglorious end to the story.
I don't think, she began, then abandoned what she was going to say. We should get away from here. There will be more of those men out looking, and some might come this way too. He nodded at her ruined gown.
Take what you need from them. I'll get into my armour again.
And there it was, exactly what she had wished for. Her pick of trews, tunic, armour, sword, bow. Medrode was fastidious about his person, and just as fastidious about the men that served him. The first man she'd downed had bled very little, for she hadn't cut the major blood vessels. She took his armour and shirt, the trews from the first man Lancelin had killed, since he hadn't voided himself when he died, and they were unsoiled, and the boots from the last one, which were almost a fit. She made it all into a bundle rather than getting changed. When he looked at her askance, she raised an eyebrow. I can ride in this, and it will take some time to cut myself out of it. I'd rather put more space between us and Medrode than stop to change. Without a pause, he nodded, mounted his horse, and offered her a hand. She used it to pull herself up behind him, settled herself over the bare rump of his horse, then put her arms around his waist tightly, so that he wouldn't hesitate to get some speed from Idris. He nudged his horse into a canter, and they were off. She became increasingly self-conscious as they rode, and conscious of him. The feel of his body under her hands, the smell of him, hoarse and clean sweat, a little blood, and what smelled like rosemary in his hair. And she became aware that her body was responding to his in a way it had never responded to Arthur. "It's the fighting," she scolded herself. "I've heard the men talking about it. I've seen them afterwards. They can't get to the camp horse quickly enough. It's the fighting and the fear of death, and then the realization, when it's all over, that you didn't die. That's all." But it wasn't all, and she knew it. From the first time she'd seen Lancelin, she had wished, without admitting it to anyone but herself and Bronwyn, that he would look at her, not as a fellow warrior, but as a woman. That he would give her the kind of glances that men gave Gyneth and Katerina. That he would touch her, not with friendly indifference, but with pent-up passion. Which was about as likely to happen as for this horse to sprout wings and fly them to Kellyweeg. She was a warrior. And she was Arthur's. Chapter 23. As she was already well aware, riding pillion on the bare rump of a cantering horse was not a comfortable way to ride, especially not a horse of her father's breeding, which had wide hips and a muscular set of hind quarters. And she hadn't ridden in, well, a very long time. Months. She'd done her best to stay limber, but by the time Lancelin slowed his mount to a walk, her legs were definitely sore. The horse wasn't any too pleased either, and she didn't blame him. "I don't suppose you have a place in mind to camp?" she asked, as she tried to adjust her perch on Idris's rump, and hoped she didn't sound as if she was whining. This patch of forest was identical to what they had been riding through, which still gave her no clue as to their location. "Where are we, anyway?"
"North of Kellyweeg," he said. "If I hadn't been following Gildas, I'd have come straight from there. You would not likely have found me at all." He shook his head. "Gildas would say one of his good spirits was watching over you. If you had kept going, and no one had stopped you, eventually you might even have reached your own father's lands."
"Well, I am very glad I did find you," she laughed. "It was a good thing for both of us. But now we are going south."
"We are, and into lands I know. As for camping, yes, I do have a place in mind," he continued. "I've used it before. It's very well concealed. We'll be riding until twilight to get there, though."
"I would rather do that than take any chance of Medrod's men catching us." She said it, and she meant it, but she knew when she finally got down off this horse, part of her would regret saying it. But even as she thought that, he turned the horse's head and sent him down into a ditch or ravine with a tiny thread of a stream running in the bottom of it, a ditch which quickly deepened until the sides were higher than their heads. There he dismounted. "Off," he said. "All three of us need to stop for just a few moments." The horse proved the truth of this by plunging his nose into the bit of a stream and noisily slurping up water. And as soon as her legs stopped hurting, the running water reminded her that there was something else she needed desperately to do. With a rueful glance at each other, they parted company until the brushwood hid them. She was still not willing to stop long enough to change clothing completely, but since she was going to have to retie everything anyway, she did cut the gown off at the hips and pull on the breeches and the boots. Immediately, and not just because she also relieved herself, she felt better, more like herself. And there was the added benefit that she had 2 large pieces of heavy fabric that were likely to come in very useful. She folded the fabric into a pad she could use under herself and trotted back to the horse and Lancelin. A little stretching left her feeling a lot happier about getting back on that horse. The leg of rabbit Lancelin fished out of a saddlebag and handed to her made her feel happier in general. She made short work of it, as he did the same with another leg.
"I'm going to stop one more time so we can hunt," he told her, as he swung himself up into the saddle, then offered her his hand and let her pull herself up behind him again. "We won't have a chance before dark otherwise, and that was the last of my provisions."
"I hope I can still remember how to use a bow," she said dryly. He laughed and put heels to his mount. True to his word, in late afternoon he did stop. Under any other circumstances, Gwen would never even have considered hunting, and not just because there might still be men out looking for them. This was springtime, and unless you were very careful, you'd shoot animals with young and leave orphaned babies to die, which was poor husbandry and land care. But there wasn't a choice. But luck was with them. He tethered Idris in the brush near a pond, and both of them could hear the quiet quacking of ducks. She nodded him towards the pond, and she headed in the direction of a glare of sunlight through the trees that probably meant a clearing. As she stalked carefully along the edge of a meadow, she heard a tussle in the grass and saw 2 hares fighting. Now hares fighting could only be male, and the male hares had no part in anything but the siring of the young ones. They went off and left the does to tend the babies alone. She froze as soon as she saw them, but they were so deep in combat they paid no attention to her. Carefully, she stuck one arrow in the ground in front of her, moving as slowly as a leaf in a light breeze. Carefully she put a second to the bow and pulled it back to her ear. She let fly, and without waiting to see if the first arrow hit, snatched up the second and put it to the string. Hares were not very bright at best, and when fighting over females, single-minded as well. The second continued to attack the first for a critical moment after it fell over dead. By the time it realized that something was wrong, and its head came up as it froze with indecision, as a few dim thoughts managed to escape from the sex madness that spring brought on, it too was dead. Feeling utterly triumphant, she collected them, gutted them then and there, cleaned her knife and the arrows with a handful of grass, and brought back the cleaned carcasses to where Lancelin had tethered the horse. He was already there, tying a gutted drake to the saddle-bow. He looked up. "Two were fighting over a hen. I shot the loser." She nodded and held up her prizes. He actually grinned as he tied the carcasses alongside his catch. As the sun set, it turned everything the color of roses. The greening forest, the sky, the clearings they passed through, and she could not help a feeling of triumph as she thought about all the nights she had seen this same rosy light fill her tiny window. She would swear that somehow she would win herself free, and now she had. "Are you disappointed," she asked into Lancelin's back, "that you weren't the one to win me free, like some warrior in a tale?" He was quiet for a while, although she did not feel his muscles tense, so, as she was used to seeing, he must have been carefully considering his words. "While the glory of being your rescuer all alone was a heady fancy, it was never more than that," he said slowly. "First, of course, I did not know if you were actually held captive by Medrote. Secondly, if you were, his men are many, and I am one. What I planned to do, I fear, is somewhat less glorious. I was going to skulk about to determine if there was a captive there, and if it was a female, and if so, where she was being held. Then to see how closely guarded she was. Then to see if it was you. After that," he shook his head, "my plans were unformed. Pray remember, so far as anyone knows, you are still in Kellywig. My first course of action would have been to free you if I could, but I assumed I would not be able to, and I would have to think who would believe me that I could count on to fight with me." She began to chuckle. "It appears that Abbot Gildas and his monks were willing and able to put up some sort of fight." His laughter was deep in his chest, and she felt it vibrate in his muscles. "I owe the abbot a profound debt of gratitude. I hope no one came to any harm." She didn't know. "I don't think Medrote would dare. Though he follows the old ways, still, a holy man is a holy man, and you harm one at your peril." While they had been speaking, the sun descended below the trees. The sky to the east darkened and filled with stars, while the sky to the west faded into ash of roses. Idris picked up his pace. It appeared the horse knew where they were going. They had to duck under low-hanging branches, and even though the leaves were barely budding, the trees were very old, enormous and thick, enough that it was hard to see. The horse could barely get between them, and his hooves made scarcely a sound on ground with a padding of old leaves that gave off a bitter scent as he picked his way over them. The air was close and warmer than it should have been. Even though Gwen was not gifted in that way, she felt the power here, humming along her skin, like the warning before lightning is going to strike nearby. And then, without any warning, the trees opened up, and before them was a ruin. It was not, as she had more than half suspected it would be, a henge. It was a small house, and not a hut, nor a cottage, of the sort her people raised, yet it was not Roman, nor of any other style that she could identify. The roof had long since vanished, and yet several trees and a litter of smaller branches and a thatch of leaves had somehow fallen across the stone walls to create a new one. "I have no idea who built this here," Lancelin said quietly. "Some druid? A lady? Whoever it was, that person had great power. Even I can feel it, and I have no gift for power at all." It welcomes us. She felt that as well. This place was pleased to have them there. He nodded, then threw his leg over his horse's neck and jumped down, lifting her down before she could dismount herself. I have come here when I need to be away from Arthur and the companions. I can think here. I can find myself, and know even what I am hiding from myself. He broke off what he was going to say, and quickly took off Idris's tack. He handed her the saddlebags and took the bucket himself. There's good dry wood in there, and a hearth, and if they have not broken, some pots. For sleeping, I fashioned a pallet, and there is good dry bracken and some old horse blankets. If you can get a fire going, I shall get water. She was about to ask from where, but he was gone. With a shrug she went into the one-room stone house and found it was just as he had said it would be. In the last light she quickly made a fire, using his flint and steel, catching the sparks in a nest of leaf fragments, blowing them into a tiny flame and feeding it with twigs until it was strong enough to take the logs. The bracken was piled in one corner, well sheltered, with the blankets atop it, and the pallet tossed atop that. Once the fire was going, she hauled the pallet, which was of more bracken stuffed inside a worn canvas cover, down beside it. As she worked, Lancelin came and went several times, filling some of the pots with water. She took the first of those, skinned and cut up the hairs, and put the pot into the side of the fire to stew. He continued to bring in water and wood, and at last left the full bucket outside with Idris. With a sigh and a wince, he settled down onto the pallet beside her. Only then did she break the silence. "If I had such a place, I would open it to no one." He did not look at her. He stared at the fire. The soft light did not touch his eyes. Not even Arthur. The air hummed with power. This was no place for lies. She touched his hand, and when he finally turned, gazed into his eyes. "Especially not Arthur." He caught his breath, and emotions chased across his face too quickly to read. "Then there is no love between you?" She tried not to feel bitterness as she shook her head. "This is the lot of princes. I knew that one day I might be needed for some bargain." "I was the unwanted part of a bargain for horses," she said, the bitterness coming through anyway. "The ladies wanted a bride for him that was pledged to the old ways. He needed an heir. The land needed one. He gave way but grudgingly. There is nothing about me, the real me, that Arthur wants. I honor him as the High King. But I do not love him, and he does not love me. He wants a dream of a compliant, complacent woman who will bend like a willow to his will, who will ornament his great hall, greet his guests graciously, bear him heirs, give him bed sport, and never seek to join him in council or battle. That is not me, and he does not want what I am." She could have wept to say it out loud at last. It felt as if she had dropped shackles from her wrists. Somewhere out in the darkness, an early frog sang. "If I had known this, I would never have consented. This is no marriage. It is bondage." Something that she had never, ever expected to see flared in his face. "Then the gods be thanked!" he cried, and clasped his hands about her face and kissed her. A fire leapt up between them, a fire that began at their lips and swiftly raced to her groin. She moaned and opened her mouth to his, even as her own hands drew him to her. His mouth was that of a starving man. It devoured her as hers devoured his. A hunger she had not known was inside her, obliterated all other thoughts except of him. Her hands, with a life of their own, unbuckled his armor. He cast it aside. His hands caressed her breasts, thumbs rubbing her sensitive nipples through the thick cloth, and the fire leapt from her groin to her breasts. She moaned into his mouth and pushed him away, just long enough to pull the remains of the gown over her head, discarding it into the darkness. His shirt followed it, and they fell back together onto the canvas pallet, touching, tasting, hands and mouths exploring one another. His fingers traced the line of her side, and she ached, arching her back as his lips and tongue played with her nipples. Impatient, more than impatient, she pulled down his breeches. Hers were already around her knees, and she kicked them off. She parted her legs for him, and he knelt between them, staring down at her, his face alight, eyes shining. "I love you, Gwenhwyfar," was all he said. Then he was on her, inside her, and the two of them moved to a rhythm all their own, until the fire became a conflagration and devoured them both. With their discarded clothing for a pillow, they lay in each other's arms and fed each other bits of hair, which by some miracle had not been burnt to blackness in the bottom of the pot. She listened to his heart pound and traced her fingers over his chin. He held her as if he would never let her go. "I think I began to love you when you spoke to me after the battle in the winter," he said quietly. "But I thought you were spoke for, maybe. And if you were not, well, you were a warrior, your father's eyes, and soon to be his right hand. You were the White Phantom, the legend the Saxons had learned to fear. What could I offer you? I have no land, let alone a kingdom. I have only my status as a companion. Not even my horse is my own." "Kataruna's husband came to us with less," she wanted to say, but how could she? That was the past, and saying something would not change it. "So I put you from my mind, and when I thought of you, told myself to think of you as another warrior, and so I did, until I saw you as Arthur's bride, so beautiful, so regal, and—" his voice choked a little. "And I knew what a fool I had been, and you were going to Arthur, and if you did not love him then, you would love him soon." "As you love him?" She did not say that either. "He does not want another wife, much less one with my name," she said quietly. "And he especially does not want one like me. He kept me as much a captive as Medrote, even if that captivity was in a cage of gold rather than stone." There was more, much, much more that she wanted to say. But these were not things that you said to a lover. "When we lay together, the only thing that kept it from being rape was my consent, and I cannot and never will welcome him into my bed. He may come there, but I cannot welcome him, for it is not me he wants, and any empty vessel would do." Or he thought I was breeding. He stayed only long enough to put a child in me, and then could not leave me fast enough. "I love you," she said, knowing it to be true. "But—" he began, his voice rising a little in distress, and she knew what he was going to say, that she was still Arthur's. Oh, not necessarily by the laws of their gods, but certainly by the law of the land and of the Christian one. That Arthur would never give her up, that they had together betrayed Arthur, just as the second Gwenhwyfar had. But the second Gwenhwyfar's betrayal was because he loved her. He does not love me. He does not even want me. And she was not going to lie here and try to counter all those things. Not though Arthur had betrayed her, because he surely could not have been so blinded by Gwenhwyfar that he didn't realize she wasn't his wife. Not that Arthur could be persuaded, she was sure, to give her up, so long as he could keep his precious horses. Instead, she stopped his protests with her lips and built the fire anew. As dawn greyed the sky, she woke, and she knew they should move on, of course. They should leave that place in the first sun of the morning, and they should ride straight to Arthur's villa. She knew that, as the thin light of dawn penetrated the trees and filtered gently in through the broken wall of the house. She knew as she listened to the birds sing, as she lay with her head propped up on one hand, watching him sleep. If they left now, they could pretend to themselves that last night had been a moment's madness, the lust that came after battle. They could pretend to forget all the things that had been said, half said, and unsaid between them. If they left now, it would all be over, and she would go back to her joyless couplings, and he would slake his needs with whatever lady of the court or serving wench was willing. And that would be unbearable. She considered her options, looked over what could be done as if she was planning a battle. A battle? No, a war. This would be a campaign. She would need to persuade so many people of so many things, first of all the ladies, that she would never ever bear Arthur an heir, because if it had not happened by now, it was never going to. For that matter, once she told them of her captivity, it would be obvious that for whatever reason the fault was with her, for certainly Medrote would have sired a child on her by now, if it had been possible. She would have to open the whole sordid tale to the ladies, and show them what a threat Medrote was to the old ways, and maybe Morgana too, though that would be harder. Morgana had done nothing overtly, and even though she had pledged herself to She of the Dark Moon, that alone did not make her a traitor, either to Arthur or to the old ways. The goddess had both a dark and a shining face, and it was wise to never forget that. And then she had to expose Medrote and her sister for what they were and what they had done before Arthur himself and his entire court and companions. Arthur's blood he might be, but he could not be Arthur's heir. She would have to find proof of what he had done. She couldn't do that without still being queen, so persuading Arthur to put her aside would have to wait until Medrote was no longer a threat, and Gwenhwyfar was properly dealt with and confined by the ladies where she could no longer harm anyone. Then, once that was all sorted out, she had to explain her situation to her sisters, and her father, and finally Arthur himself. She almost groaned at the thought of what it was going to take. It could be a year, more, until she and Lancelin were free to be together. But she was a king's daughter, and the wife of the High King, and the good of the land and the people came before her own desires. This land must be made safe from Medrote. A new bride for Arthur must be found, one that could be as compliant and complacent as he desired. Yes, even if she were a follower of the Christ priests. Unlike the ladies, after knowing Gildas, and after having the abbot himself come so gallantly to her rescue, she was by no means convinced that their way was at odds with the old ways. Did they too not have a lady that they served? Their god had died and returned. Oh, this could take months, a year in which every moment of every day must be spent in cunning, in persuasion. And yes, she would do this. This would serve the greatest good for the land and for the king. Even her leaving and making way for another was not entirely selfish. But she could not face that year without having a little joy hoarded up for herself. She needed this in ways she had not even been able to imagine before last night. Besides, she looked at Lancelin, at the shadows under his eyes, at the deep bruises on his chest and stomach, at the half-healed wounds on arms, shoulders, and hands. He needed this too. Not just the love. He needed the rest. Arthur was hard on his companions, but Lancelin was harder still on himself. How long had it been since he had actually taken the time to heal? Too long, by the look of things. So they would not be leaving this morning, and not for several more mornings. She put her head back down on his chest, let the morning light creep across their bodies and warm them, and drifted off to sleep again in its embrace. She sat drooping a little on the pallet. "I can't," she said quietly but firmly. "I cannot ride today, and maybe not tomorrow. I haven't ridden in over a year. My hips feel as if they have been dislocated, and if I get back on Idris today, I am going to be half crippled." That was not even a lie, and not much of an exaggeration. "And look at you." She gestured at him as he stood half-clothed in front of her. He was the very image of the young god to her at that moment, haloed with sunlight, motes of dust drifting about him. She fought back desire that made her body ache, and concentrated on winning him. "What if Medrote ambushes us? You are in no fit shape for a fight." He opened his mouth to protest. She gave him a measuring look. "Be honest," she warned. This was Gwenhwyfar the warrior speaking to Lancelin the warrior, and he recognized it as such. He shut his mouth, looked at her with longing that made her feel warm inside. He heard the warrior and wanted the warrior woman. She seized on his hesitation and capitalized on it. "I need rest," she said plaintively. "So do you. And who is being harmed if we take it?" She watched his hesitation fading. "What about warning Arthur?" he asked, biting his lip. "Medrote?" "Medrote dares not make a move against Arthur until he knows where I am, and whether I am alive or dead." She had thought about this long and hard, and truly, if there had been danger that Medrote would act, she would be on that wretched horse this moment. "Gwenhwyfar will probably flee when she knows I have escaped, and even if she does not, Medrote does not dare leave her there for fear of what will happen to her when I do appear. I do not think he trusts her, because I do not think he trusts anyone. He won't risk her betraying him. Arthur is in no worse danger if we remain here long enough to heal." "But how do we explain taking so long to return to Kellywig?" She chuckled. "We were pursued. We were elf-led. We were just plain lost. You were wounded. I was ill or injured. It doesn't matter. There is no one to dispute what we say." He sighed, and his expression turned wistful. "There is truly no danger to Arthur." She bit back a sharp retort. "Are you more in love with Arthur than with me?" It was unfair, unkind, and yes, it was somewhat true. The bond that tied him to Arthur was complex. Worship of the office and the man, admiration, friendship, a kinship of spirit. Yes, it was love. He had loved Arthur long before he had met her. He would love Arthur without regard to Arthur's flaws. and while she could not help but feel more than a little jealous, this was something that men did, felt. They needed this. Perhaps it was the way that they saw the reflection of the gods on earth in their earthly brothers. Even Gildas's monks felt this same passion for their abbot. She had seen this many, many times in her men, mostly for her father, sometimes for their war chiefs, and occasionally for her. So she could and would feel the pain of jealousy, but it was a foolish, stupid woman who thought to take this from the heart of her man, as well to cut off what made him a man. "I have seen no visions," she said, patting the pallet, so that he finally sat beside her. "I cannot say for certain, but this is what I am sure of, based on what I know of Medrote and of my sister." The memory of Medrote sitting beside her as she struggled with the haze of his potions made her feel like vomiting. "Medrote talked a great deal to me, talked at me, that is." He interrupted her, cupping a hand to her cheek. "Don't think about it," he said urgently, and then kissed her. "As long as Arthur will be safe a little while we tarry, then tarry we will." He kissed her again, this time lingering, his hand straying from her cheek to her breast. "Now, let me drive his shadows from your heart." The fire rose between them again, and she lost herself in it. Chapter 24. They lingered 7 days. 7 days that would have been utterly blissful had they not been overshadowed by the knowledge that these days would come to an end, that they would have to return to Arthur and the companions and pretend that nothing whatsoever had happened between them. If it were not for that, she would have been happier than she had ever been in her life. 7 days during which she was more completely herself than she had ever been since her childhood. 7 nights so full of love-speech and love-making, it seemed as if she was packing enough loving moments for a lifetime into those warm, honeyed nights. They confided secrets, revelations, history and memories, and then between them they made more. She learned that he had been raised by one of the ladies who said she was his guardian. He had no reason to doubt her, since there was not the slightest resemblance between her and him. She had him trained in all the arts of war, then sent him on his way with armor, sword, and horse, giving him directions to Kellywig when he was 20. There he became one of Arthur's companions, not the first, but soon the closest, for of all of the companions, Lancelin's education most closely matched Arthur's, and they spoke the same language. He had remained the closest until the second Gwenhwyfar. Then the estrangement began, and she could tell it hurt then and still hurt. She did her best to soothe that hurt, but there was no denying that what she and he had was going to drive another wedge into the widening breach between him and the High King. The most ordinary act took on weight and meaning when they shared it. She laughed more than she had in 10 years. But at the end of the 7th day he began packing up their things, and although her throat ached with sudden sorrow to see him do so, she did not protest. All things had to end. There was even a tiny leavening of relief that now the dread of ending was over. By now Medrote knew he could not recapture her. By now Gwenhwyfar must know she had escaped. Gwen and Lancelin needed to find out what both of them were doing, and then put their own campaign into motion. If they were to have a life together, it would have to begin by giving each other up for a time. Even she ate so much she felt as if she was bleeding from every pore. So at dawn on the 8th day Lancelin saddled Idris and loaded him with their scant property. Wearing the looted shirt, breeches, and boots, Gwen helped him, and when everything was ready and they had led Idris out into the meadow, they both turned back for a last look at the place that neither of them wanted to leave. She felt a heavy weight of grief settle over her, and a lump form in her throat. She fought back tears with every particle of will and determination that she had mastered over the years, but her heart felt as if it was going to burst with sorrow. The time ahead when she must never look at him, never touch him, never give a sign of her love, stretched out like a road of ashes that she would never see the end of. She wanted to throw herself down on the ground and wail, or grab him and beg him to come with her, far away, anywhere. But if she did that, if they did that, it would be the murder of part of themselves. Duty and responsibility had made them what they were. Could they still love each other when they both would have betrayed that? Would they be the same people? And even if they were, knowing that they had forsaken that, there must then always be the doubt, the wonder, if they would forsake each other. No, they must endure this, and she must endure it without weeping. She must have let a single sniff escape, though, for in the next moment he had wrapped his arms around her. She turned her face into his chest and gave herself a single moment of weakness.
"This is the hardest thing I have ever done, to go back to him after—"
Her eyes burned with tears. She blinked them back. "I know," he murmured into her hair. "And to see you, and not be able to touch you, it will be like death 1,000 times a day. But I will never leave you. Even if all I can do is look at you, I will never leave you. I love you, Gwen."
"Oh, how very touching."
The sarcastic voice, hatefully familiar, cut across the clearing. She felt as if someone had dropped her into the heart of winter. Her pulse fluttered erratically. She felt sick as she slowly turned her head. Just where the path they were going to take began, Medrote stepped out from under the trees, sword held loosely in his hand, wearing a carelessly sardonic expression. Except for one thing, his eyes were furious. Gwen stared at him, mind going numb, but her own hand reaching for her sword. With almost the same motion, she and Lancelin drew their weapons and stood side by side, prepared to defend each other.
"How charming," Medrote sneered.
But as his eyes rested on Gwen, she clenched her hand on her sword hilt. He was never, ever going to forgive her this.
"How delightful! You love each other. And how long, I wonder, have you been so enamored? Months? Years? What a lovely couple you make, don't they, my king?"
To Gwen's horror, Arthur stepped out of the shadows to stand beside him. And so did an entire half-circle of warriors, all of Medrote's brothers among them. She felt choked. She could scarcely breathe.
Arthur's face was black with rage, but he said nothing. Perhaps he was too furious to speak, and all that Gwen could do was stare helplessly, all of her plans in ruins at her feet. There was only one thing she thought she could salvage from the wreckage.
"He can't charge us with treason. We never conspired to take his throne, not like the last wife."
"So when were you planning to take the High King's throne along with his wife, Lancelin?"
Medrote asked poisonously, as if he was reading her mind. He smiled at her, his eyes dancing with malice.
"Never."
Her heart thrilled with pride at the steadiness of Lancelin's voice.
"I never wanted a throne, not Arthur's, nor that of any other king."
"Ah, but on the wife," Medrote grinned. But that grin goaded her as nothing else had until now. That hateful grin. She had been forced to suffer it for months. That grin that said, "I won, you lost, and there is nothing you can do about it." Her mind unfroze as a flash of rage fired it, and in a flash she assessed the situation. Lancelin, had one chance to escape this. He was a superb horseman. She had seen him leap into the saddle and ride off at full gallop. If he did that now, no one would be able to stop him. The warriors around them were carrying bows, but they had swords in their hands, not bows. They were also, some of them, still in a state of shock and disbelief, while the rest were his friends, and for the moment they would hesitate to attack him. He could get away as long as he didn't hesitate nor pause for anything. If he stayed long enough to pull her up behind him, though. "Lance," she whispered urgently, making sure not to move her lips too much, "get on Idris and get out of here." Shock at her words made him glance down at her, though he did not move his head. "But—" "Leave me," she made it a command. "He's not thinking, and he won't, old stag that he is, while the young stag stands before him. He'll never listen to anything as long as you stand here. He'll challenge you, and you'll either let him kill you or kill him yourself. There's no other outcome for this. If he kills Arthur, he'll never be able to look at me again without thinking of that. And if Arthur kills him, I will follow." She heard the breath catch in his throat. He loved Arthur, still loved Arthur. "Go," she hissed. "He won't harm me. He'll lose the ladies and my father if he does." Though Arthur might not be able to think at this moment, Lancelin certainly could, and her logic was inescapable. With an inarticulate cry of grief that wrung her heart and made a sob catch in her throat, he leapt into the saddle with a single jump. Idris, well used to what this meant, reared a little and plunged towards an opening in the line. The warriors, caught off guard, or perhaps not really wanting to try and stop him, did not react in time. He flashed between them and was gone. With a look of contempt at Medrote that should have blasted him on the spot, Gwen tossed down her sword and waited for them to take her prisoner. She paced the tiny, dark hut that they had locked her into. Ironic that they had brought her here, to Glastonbury Abbey. But Abbot Gildas had interceded again, so she'd heard, but she didn't know first-hand, of course, since she hadn't been allowed to see anyone but her guards. But that explained why she was here, and not at Arthur's stronghold. That good old man was still honouring their friendship. She hoped he wouldn't lose by it. The hut walls were not that thick, and the guards gossiped. She heard practically every word they said. Arthur was incoherent with anger. There was no word of Medrote. There was no word of Lancelin either, which she took as a good sign. The guards didn't know what Arthur planned to do with her. Well, he could plan all he wanted to, but that did not alter the law. It was not yet treason for a woman, even a queen, to take a lover. She could, if she chose, even make the argument that she had only done so to give him an heir. And in between bouts of weeping, she toyed with that idea. But it would be a lie, and she decided against it. She had done with lying to Arthur to save his pride. They'd brought her a gown. She'd refused to change into it. She had no intention of surrendering her identity as a warrior a second time. She did behave herself honourably otherwise, did not rush the guards that brought her food and water and took away the bucket. She did not insult them, nor shout at them, nor demand anything of them. She stood quietly in a corner, let them come and do what they needed to do at dawn and dusk, and spoke only when she was spoken to. And yes, she wept. She had cried until her eyes were sore and dry, and her cheeks sore, and nose sore and red with weeping. But she had done so silently. If, When Arthur finally confronted her, she was going to force him to acknowledge what she was, in no small part because that was what Gwenhwyfar was not. It had been 3 days. That was a cold sort of comfort. The more time that passed, the more chance there was for her friends to rally to her side. The more that passed, the further away Lancelin would get, and the more likely that Arthur's anger with him would cool a little. The only thing that worried her was, time was also on Medroat's side. She had to fight with herself constantly, every waking moment, not to break down completely. This was like the conflict with Medroat, in a way, and she dared not show any weakness, not if she was going to be taken seriously. It was worst on waking, for her dreams were full of Lancelin. In her dreams she was back in their sanctuary, held joyfully in his arms, and when she woke to find herself curled in the heap of straw in the mud-walled hut, the pain of disappointment was so bitter she could hardly keep herself from crying out with it. Lying in the darkness, waiting for sleep, was almost as bad. That was when the doubt and the fear plagued her, dogged her every heartbeat, and warned her that no matter what, this had forever poisoned what lay between them, that nothing would ever be the same again, that forced to choose between her and Arthur, Lance would always choose Arthur. Those thoughts were like knives in her gut, and although those thoughts were worst at night, when she fought for sleep, they were never far away. So she paced, counting the paces, as she had paced in Medroat's prison. She rehearsed what she was going to say, over and over, how she would react, what she would do. She had to take the offensive. The ground was all Arthur's. She had to force him to react to what she said and did, not the other way around. She had to put him on the defensive. She was rehearsing it all for the 100th time, when she heard the bar holding her in scrape across the door of the hut. The sound made her freeze, for it was neither dawn nor dusk. She turned slowly to face the little wooden door. 2 guards stood there, 2 of the companions that she was not familiar with. "Lady," one said hesitantly, peering into what must have been dark to him. His voice was very young. "Lady, you are to come with us." "I am Gwenhwyfar," she said steadily. "Queen, perhaps. War chief, certainly. Not lady." She stalked out of the darkness of the hut and into the light, her eyes narrowed so that it didn't blind her, her back straight as a staff. "Lead on," she said evenly, taking in her surroundings as soon as her eyes adjusted. The island tour of the Isle of Glass loomed to her right, but it was more distant than she had thought, and all around her were the tents of a camp. This looked like a little farmer's hut, or a shepherd's, that Arthur had commandeered to hold her. So she was not on the abbey grounds after all. Perhaps Arthur had wanted to put some distance between them and the isle, for fear Gwyn ap Nudd would interfere in some way. Which was foolish thinking. If Gwyn wanted to interfere, not the breadth of a kingdom would prevent him from doing so. She eyed the guards. They were very young, very young. Evidently her good behavior had convinced Arthur that he need not put his stoutest warriors over her. They flushed as she looked them over. New armor, new tunics. With whom had they served before joining Arthur? Were they the younger sons of one of his allies? She wondered what they were thinking. "Well," she said when they didn't move, "if you are to lead me, then do so, if you please." They flushed again, and one of them made an abortive gesture in the general direction of the largest tent in the encampment, which was, of course, precisely where she would expect Arthur's tent to be, since the encampment was laid out in the Roman style. She nodded and moved off at a deliberate pace, neither dragging her feet nor rushing. She didn't want these boys to have even a vestige of alarm about them, because she had plans of her own. 2 more guards at the tent entrance held the flaps open for her. Just as deliberately she stalked inside, and the canvas dropped in place behind her. Arthur waited for her there, flanked by Abbot Gildas and his foster-brother Kai, and 2 more pairs of guards. And before any of them could move or speak, she took the offensive. Literally. She crossed the space between them quickly, while they were still reacting to her presence, and slapped Arthur as hard as she could with the back of her hand. The crack shattered the silence and shocked them all speechless, which was exactly the way she wanted it. "If I had a gauntlet, it would be at your feet, husband," she spat. "How dare you? How dare you take exception to anything I have done, when you just spent the last 7 months fornicating with my sister?" Arthur's mouth dropped open in sheer shock. His eyes went wide, and her handprint reddened on his cheek. "My sister," she repeated viciously, "who also happens to be married to Medrote. While Medrote held me captive in his villa, amused himself with me whenever he chose, and you didn't even notice the difference."
"Wait," Arthur stammered. "What—"
"Ask Abbot Gildas," she said, crossing her arms over her chest. "He managed to deduce the truth without even having a decent conversation with the bitch. Or ask Lancelin. Ah, no, wait, you can't, because you wanted to kill him, so to keep from harming so much as a hair on your head, he was forced to play the coward and flee. Because he knew you'd keep throwing yourself at him in a rage, no matter what we said." Arthur was not a fool. She had taken him by surprise. He recovered quickly.
"What kind of an idiot do you take me for, with this farcical tale of a sister like enough to you to be your twin?" he began. "And married to Medrote? Lady, you strain the bounds of—"
There was a not very polite cough from behind her. "I presume that you will take my word as truth," the Lady Eronwen said acerbically. Arthur's face took on a look of confusion again, not because he was confused by what the lady had said. No, it was surely because he was trying to find a diplomatic way to respond. Eronwen did not give him time. "I can bring 100 direct witnesses from Pwythyl, nay more," she snapped, "not to mention an equal number from Lothian. Gwenhwyfar of Pwythyl has always had a younger sister, as like to her as a twin, and separated from her by less than a year. So much so, that though the brat's given name was Gwyneth, she got the name Gwenhwyfar, and her true name was almost forgotten." The number of dropping jaws around the tent far outnumbered those who could keep their countenance in the face of such information. "Moreover," Eronwen continued, "the girl was fostered to Anna Morgause, and schooled by her and by Morgana in magic. She grew to womanhood in Lot's court, and wedded to Medrote." She raised an eyebrow. "Yes, Arthur, your son by Anna Morgause wedded his foster sister, Gwenhwyfar's near twin, who was schooled in the same kind of magic as his mother wielded. The same kind of magic that drew you to Anna Morgause's bed in the first place, and brought about Medrote." The lady stepped up past Gwen, and stood in nearly the same position. "As to whether she was the one in your bed the last several months, that I cannot say, but it seems logical." "And you might ask yourself, and your men, just where Medrote is now," Gwen said angrily. "Where are his men? And you might ask yourself just what someone raised by Lot thought he was going to gain by putting his wife in your bed. And you might—" But she got no chance to go further with that thought, for at that moment there was a commotion outside the tent, and someone else shoved his way in through the tent flaps. It was Gwalchmai, and beneath the beard and the dirt and blood he was as white as snow. He clutched his shoulder, where red stained his armor and tunic.
"The gods forgive me, Arthur,"
he blurted, swaying where he stood.
"Medrote, that misborn, misbegotten son of a witch and a demon. Medrote's on the way here, at the head of a Saxon army."
For one moment there was no sound in that tent. It was as if the world stopped dead in shock. Except, perhaps, for Gwen. There was a part of her that had expected this moment, had known it was coming all along, and nodded in bitter recognition of that. That was why she recovered first, and whirled, her gaze stabbing one of the 2 young warriors who had escorted her here. "You!" she snapped. "Get me armor to fit my frame. My armor, if someone brought it here, and a sword, and most importantly a bow and a horse of my father's breeding, my Rhys or Pryderi, if they are here." Her voice seemed to jar them all back to life. The young man gaped at her and looked at Arthur. She frowned back over her shoulder at him. "You are going to need every warrior you have, Arthur. I saw your camp. Most of your warriors are not here," she said, her tone clipped and precise. Maybe they were all doomed. Maybe they had been doomed from the beginning, but she would still fight right up to the moment that doom fell upon her. "Medrot must have been planning this for a long time. This is not a good ground to fight on. The only advantage you have is that it is equally bad for both sides." Arthur looked grey, as if the ground had been cut out from under him. So Medrot's treachery cut him deeper than her defection? Well, so be it. That was just one more indication of how little he had thought of her and what she truly was, how little he had valued it. But he had his wits about him enough to see that she was right. "Do as Gwenhwyfar commands," he told the boy, and turned to Kai. "Muster out the men. Send messengers. Gwalchmai, how many are there?" "Same as last time." The old man, when had Gwalchmai gotten old, clutched his shoulder as Kai pushed past him. "It's the full Saxon army, the one that retreated when we confronted them. That encounter was just a feint to test us and get our numbers. Medrot was planning this all along, planning to get you separated from the rest of your force. We're outnumbered, Arthur, badly." Arthur grimaced and grew paler, but he straightened, and Gwen saw that, like her, though doom fell upon them, he would fight to the last. "Maybe not as badly as you think." Gwen's mind was racing. "Let me go to Innis Witrin. I'll see if I can call Gwyn ap Nudd out. You likely won't get fighters out of him, but he might make a passage for yours to come quickly. There's more than one tale of mortal armies passing through Annwn at need, and he is one of your companions and an ally king." Right now, she wished profoundly she could be the one to lead those armies here, but the King of Annwn would be the only one who could. "I'll go with you," the lady said quickly, before Arthur could say yea or nay. "With 2 of us, he is less likely to refuse." Arthur looked for a moment as if he was going to refuse anyway, but then shrugged. "Whatever can be done, we must do," he said, his face a mask of resignation. Gwen didn't wait for him to change his mind. She strode out of the tent with the lady sailing behind her. There were several horses tethered beside Arthur's tent, and to her intense relief one of them was her Pryderi, who tossed his head, whickered, and picked up his ears when he scented her. Whoever had appropriated him, well, too bad. They were going to have to find themselves another mount. She ran to the picket line, pulled his reins loose, and hauled herself up into his saddle. The stirrups were set too long. She ignored them for now. The day she couldn't sit a horse for a straight run without stirrups would be a sad one indeed. As Eronwen stood in the path, she rode up next to the lady and offered her hand. Eronwen weighed next to nothing. Did the ladies never eat? And Gwen was able to pull her up behind with just a little grunt of effort. As ever, Pryderi responded as if he could read her mind. He danced a little and leapt into a full gallop, answering her touch on the reins to arrow towards the distant isle, which rose above its perpetual mist as if it didn't truly belong in this world. Behind her, Gwen heard the camp coming to life. shouted orders, and the frantic clashing of men getting armoured and armed. In her ear she heard the lady softly chanting. What she chanted, well, Gwen didn't recognize it at all. It was older than any word she knew, but she felt it, felt the power in those words, and felt that power being drawn from somewhere ahead of them. Pryderi's ears swiveled, then pointed ahead again. He had never been disturbed by anything. She had schooled him to that. They neared the mist, and the mist swelled and billowed out to meet them in a solid wall of white. Pryderi plunged into it without hesitation. "Slow him," the lady said in her ear, but she was already reining Pryderi in, lest he make a misstep, go tumbling, and kill them all. He tossed his head with rebellion, for he loved to run, but dropped immediately to a walk. The mist closed around them, so thick that it was even hard to see the ground right under Pryderi. It clung to them, chill, damp, carrying with it a scent of water and green things. Pryderi's hoofbeat sounded muffled, as if he walked on thick moss. Gwen looked about and up, trying to catch the landmark of Inniswitrin, but there was nothing but mist. "Give him his head," the lady said. "Trust his instincts. If the King of Anwin is inclined to open his door to us—" "The King of Anwin could not fail to welcome the Lady of the Cauldron well and the white apparition." Gwyn ap Nudd's voice came calmly out of the mist ahead of them. Pryderi stopped. The mist swirled a little, then parted, and then Gwen stepped out of it, putting one hand on Pryderi's bridle. He looked up at Gwen. "So, Arthur needs his men. I can and will bring them through the doors of Anwin." She let out the breath she had been holding at his answer, and bowed in the saddle. "Then I thank you, Lord of Anwin." He shook his head. "Do not thank me," he said, his eyes growing dark and sad, releasing Pryderi and turning back into the mist. "I do them no favors, cousin, for I bring them to their deaths." Chapter 25. Gwen wished that she could see Medrote's face. From where she sat on her horse's back, all she could see was the suit of armor and the blank faceplate of his helmet. There was no doubt it was him, though. The helm already had a golden coronet around it. It seemed he was very confident of victory over Arthur. It was the first time she'd ever seen him in armor, although she had no doubt that he knew its weight well, and the use of that sword he had strapped to his side. He had been one of Arthur's companions after all, and that wasn't just an honorary title. Medrote might avoid fighting whenever possible, but he clearly was able to give a good accounting of himself when he had to. But right now he surely found himself feeling disconcerted. He had come with his army of Saxons at his back, expecting to find Arthur and no more than 200 of his warriors. Instead, he found himself facing Arthur and every fighter that could be persuaded to cross the arcane gates into and out of Anwin to be here. And for Arthur's sake, that had been nearly all of them. Even Lancelin. Lancelin had arrived on his own, weary, on an exhausted horse. He had been taken straight to Arthur. She did not know what had transpired between the two men. She had not been privy to any of it, and he had made no attempt to seek her out for explanations or otherwise. But Lancelin now held the left flank of the army in his old position, as Kai held the right. Not by word or gesture had he even acknowledged that she was there, and by now only the bands of her will held the pieces of her heart together. He had chosen, and as she had known he must, he had chosen the king. The armies faced one another across a watercourse barely large enough to be called a river. The timely arrival of his men had allowed Arthur to move his forces to slightly better ground before Medrote's arrival. This place was called Cumlan, according to the local farmer who had guided Gwen to several good places to position archers. But Arthur was determined to avoid a battle if he could possibly help it. He had hoped that a show of force would make Medrote change his mind, hoped that he could strike some sort of bargain with his son. So now, two armies of nearly equal size faced each other across a tiny river swollen with spring rains. Medrote's face was hidden behind that helmet, with a faceplate of blackened metal. Arthur wore only the open-faced helm of a Roman soldier that he had worn all his life as a warrior. And so they are, on the field as in life. Medrote always concealing what he truly is behind a mask, Arthur never concealing anything. Except he had, of course. He had hidden so many things. His own birth had been concealed. He himself had been hidden until he had come of age to take back his father's kingship. He had hidden the fact that he had sired Medrote, hidden that he had tried to kill the infant, hidden that he had caused the slaughter of who knew how many others in an effort to get the one he faced now. He had hidden that Medrote was his son. So many things hidden. It was as if they had conspired together to create this very situation, making one bad choice after another. One thing she would not do. She was not going to lay this at the feet of the gods. No, this was all the doing of mortals, people who had made decisions that ranged from ill-advised to evil, including, if she was to be honest, some of her own. An envoy approached Arthur's lines, a white pennon tied to his spear. Another, sent from Arthur, met him at the edge of the river. They conferred. Arthur's envoy returned, then came back and planted his pennon at the river's edge. There was a flurry of activity, and a few moments later Gwen felt her sleeve being pulled. She turned to see that fresh-faced young man from Arthur's entourage. He blushed. He seemed to do that a lot. "You are wanted for the parley, warrior," he said, stumbling as he tried not to say lady. She nodded, and left one of her men in charge as she joined Arthur, who still would not look at her. Well, let him sulk. She gazed defiantly at him before following him down to the river's edge, where Medrote already waited. The tension was intense. Faces were strained, and hands hovered near weapons. It would not take much to cause these men to explode into violence. She tried not to show her surprise to see that Gwenhwyfar waited there too, just behind Medrote. Arthur, however, did not restrain a start to see her sister, and in fact he finally glanced over at Gwen before looking back at Medrote's wife. Nor was he the only one. If it had not been that one was gowned and coiffed as a queen, and the other had her hair bound up and was in armour, it would have been as if they were reflections of each other. "So, all of you who didn't believe me, there you are, my dear sister, in the flesh, and looking more the queen than I do." And that seemed petty. Was there any reason for Gwenhwyfar to have dressed as if for a coronation? Medrote pulled off his helmet and tucked it under his arm. His face was utterly unreadable. "Well, father," he began just a little too casually. But anything he was going to say was interrupted by his wife. Gwenhwyfar suddenly stormed across the grass between them, and before Gwen could even think to move or speak, slapped her so hard across the face that her lips split and she saw stars and tasted blood. "You witless loon!" Gwenhwyfar hissed. "Fool! Idiot! All my life you were first. All my life I was second to you. Finally I was first. Finally I was the one that someone loved, and you ruined that." She seized Gwen's hair and wrenched her head around with shocking strength. "All he asked was for you to love him and be a true woman for him. All. And what did you do? You sat for months in his court and cried for your toy armor and sword like a spoiled brat. And I gave him what he wanted, and he loved me, and you took that away from me." With a wrench she flung Gwen to her knees. "You are no woman," she spat. "You're a half-man. He should have been mine." Gwen stayed on her knees as her mind raced. Now she knew what it was that her visions in Medroat's cell had shown her. Little Gwen had not fallen entranced with Arthur. She had seen a way to take Gwen's place with a man who wanted what she was. She had probably been planning to betray Medroat, or at least put this day off until Arthur died naturally, thus having her crown in both the present and future. But Gwen had escaped and spoiled all of that. Finally she rose slowly and looked into her sister's furious eyes. "Well, little sister," she said, weighing each word and casting them like weapons, "all my life you have coveted what I had, even when you didn't truly want it or were ill-suited to it. You wanted Medroat because you thought I wanted him and would be jealous of your married state, but your husband married you because he could not have me." She wiped away the blood from her lip with the back of her hand. "It must be causing laughter among the gods that my husband saw in you the reflection of what he wanted me to be, and was enchanted. You rightly say that you were the one Arthur wanted, and not me, though he knew it not. Given that, I believe that the scales are even between us." Gwenhwyfar went white with fury, but before she or anyone else could say another word, there was a cry and a flash of light on metal upon the slope where the two armies had drawn near, dangerously near one another. And another great chorus of shouts and the cry of "Treachery!" and the parley disintegrated into chaos as fighting erupted on that slope and in a flash spread over the entire field. Screaming warriors charged from both sides and overran where Arthur's party stood. Gwen found herself separated from the rest and trying to beat her way back to her archers as the two armies surged forward and clashed. For a moment, before any real blows were struck, she felt hysterical laughter bubbling up inside her. And then, as always, her world narrowed to the fighting in front of her, everything blurring into stroke and counterstroke, spin and blow and evasion. The noise was deafening. She shut it out. Once she got a glimpse of Lancelin riding through a sea of fighters, striking out on either side with his sword. Once of Medroat and Arthur, fighting furiously like a pair of stags, oblivious to everything around them. Arthur's skill was greater than Medroat, but Medroat was younger. But mostly it was just trying to stay alive, slipping in mud and blood, breathing the stink of spilled guts and voided bowels, with a stitch in her side and a burning gash across her forehead, with her arm growing heavier with every swing, and her heart in bits at her feet. It all blurred together, until she was fighting in a kind of animal stupor, going on nothing but training and instinct. And then, it seemed, she woke to find herself alone, and without an opponent, and there was nothing more to fight. Somehow she had gotten to the edge of the battlefield, and as she looked about and saw no more enemies, her sword dropped from fingers too tired to hold it. Then she dropped to her knees, legs too weary to keep her upright. Numbly she looked over the field again, and saw nothing standing, nothing moving, nothing but the dead, and a mist rolling over the battlefield to thicken and hide it. It was a vision of horror and carnage, out of the end of some epic tale, and one that does not end well for anyone. A tale that ends with all the heroes dead. Despair overwhelmed her. She threw back her head and howled, sobbed, and keened a wordless lament. And she wasn't even sure who she was weeping for. Arthur? Lancelin? Herself? The end of the world. For surely this was the end, the very end of the world. After this, what could there be? Death, death, death. Nothing left but darkness and death. She sagged back on her heels, and the tears poured from that void where her heart had been. She had thought she had wept before. It had been nothing to this. And the only thought left to her, if thought it could be at all, was that she would sit here forever and weep forever, until she turned into a weeping stone and poured her waters into the little river that must now run red with blood until the end of time. "Gwenhwyfar! Gwenhwyfar!" Someone was calling her name, shaking her, would not let her mourn in peace. She shook her again, harder. Finally, to make it stop, she looked up through eyes so swollen with weeping they were only slits. And the shock of what she saw, with mist weaving around them both, dried her tears in an instant. "You, Queen!" she gasped. Arthur's second wife, cloaked and robed like one of Gildas's monks, put back her hood with an impatient hand. There was no doubt. It was the same woman who was supposed to be dead. Yes, well, queen no longer, but yes. I was Arthur's second wife. Now get up and come with me. We have need of you." "We?" She shook her head. This was impossible. How had anyone survived? Who? "Come, warrior. I tell you, you are needed for the journey across Annwn, and Gwyn ap Nudd cannot hold the door forever." As if she had no will of her own, Gwen got to her feet and yielded to the phantom's urgent tugs on her arm. Though if the second Gwenhwyfar was a phantom, she was an uncommonly strong and solid one. "Where?" "Gildas persuaded Arthur to put me aside. Melwas's love didn't last past being confronted with an army." The queen's voice dripped with contempt, then softened. "Gildas is a good man. I have been doing penance for my sins under his instruction. But Arthur needs us now. Arthur needs all of us now." Her voice cracked a little. "He is dying. I thought he was already dead." The mist swirled and billowed around them, making it seem as if they moved through a landscape of dream or nightmare. They picked their way through tangled, motionless bodies, and seemed to be heading for the single patch of light in the thickening shadows. And then the mist parted before them. Lit by torches, Arthur lay on a crude stretcher, his head pillowed on someone's wadded-up tunic, surrounded by a handful of his companions, all of them with expressions contorted with grief. It was obvious to Gwen that no one could survive the terrible wound in his gut. It had been bound up, but from the amount of blood that had soaked the bandages, he could not have much longer. Kneeling beside him, his hand clutched in both of hers, was Gwenhwyfar. "And you really are the sister," he was saying. Little Gwen bent over his hand, weeping, and nodded. He sighed. "Then you are the one that I loved most truly, most dearly, and I could never be healed of that sickness of love," he said tenderly. "You are my true queen, and ruler of my heart, who knew the desires of mine without my ever needing to speak them." His free hand moved feebly to the bandages, and his breath caught. "Medrot is dead. No one has ever survived a single blow of Caliburn, and I struck him 9 times. But his return blow was as deep as mine, and as full as fatal. I shall die soon." "No!" little Gwen cried out. "No, no! You can't leave me! I need you! I'm meant to be your queen!" He could only shake his head a very little as his companions wept.
A new figure loomed out of the mist, Gwyn ap Nudd, who nodded to the old queen and Gwen.
"Arthur," he said, his voice deep and sonorous, "it is time." Little Gwen looked up at him as if to protest, but at a single stern look from him she shut her mouth, muffled her weeping, got up and stood aside. 4 shadowy figures came from behind the King of Annwn. They approached the stretcher and took it up. Gwyn ap Nudd gestured to all 3 of the women to follow. "You bear witness," said Gwyn, as the companions watched, seemingly unable to move. "You see that these 3 queens, all beloved of Arthur, come to bear him through Annwn to the Isle of Glass." The companions stared. Gwen wanted to say something to them, but a power greater than she could deny pulled her after the others. The mist closed behind them as they approached the river-bank. The shadow warriors put the stretcher gently on a boat that was tied to the bank. Gwyn gestured to the 3 of them to enter it as well. "I can go no further," Gwyn said, "but the gate is open for you, cousin, and by your bargain with my people, none will harm you in passage." Gwen went to the prow and stood there, facing the river and the mist. Little Gwen again took her place at Arthur's side and held his hand. "And you, queen that was, you know the way. Yours will be the guiding hand." The old queen took the tiller, and the shadow warriors, which all seemed to have the heads of beasts, stag, wolf, bear, and otter, pushed it off. For a long time there was only mist and water, the splashing of waves interrupted only with little Gwen's sobs. Gwen thought she saw vague shadows in the water and in the mist, but they never approached the boat, so she was never entirely sure of what she saw. She felt empty and exhausted, as if she had left all of her emotions back there on the river-bank. And then, out of the mist, loomed a small wooden dock with more shadow figures on it, silhouetted by torches. But these were not Gwyn ap Nudd's beast-men. Somehow Gwen was unsurprised to see that they were robed in the garb of monks, and that Abbot Gildas led them. A good dozen hands reached for the boat and helped guide it to the dock and make it fast. More of them reached for the stretcher on which Arthur lay. As they lifted him out of the boat, to Gwen's shock, he opened his eyes and raised his hand. "Wait," he whispered, and beckoned to her. She found tears pouring down her cheeks again.
Forgive me," she choked out. "I never meant to harm you. I wanted to protect you from Medrot. And then, I thought you didn't care for me. I thought you would be pleased to see the back of me."
"It is you who should forgive me. I tried to make you what you were not. I took a war-horse and tried to fit it to a plough." Pain contorted his face for a moment. "Go and be yourself again. I release you from every promise, every duty, everything." He waved his hand. The monks carried him away, with Gwenhwyfar in close attendance, leaving Gwen and the old queen standing on the dock. And in that moment a blankness came over Gwen, mercifully taking all thoughts with it. Gwen came back to herself, sitting in the abbey church, with no recollection of how she had gotten there, nor how she had come to be clean of the mud and blood of combat, and reclothed in another set of trews and tunic. The old queen was on her knees at the altar in front of the church, but Gwen could not muster the strength or the will to move. It was dark in here, with only the candles on the altar for light and a small red lamp, but it was also dark beyond the windows. Somehow full night had fallen, not the strange twilight of the mist, while she had sat unaware. Another blank came over her. This one was probably not as long as the last, for when it passed, Gildas was sitting beside her, and peered at her when she moved her head a little. "Ah," he said, "you are back among us." She nodded, and looked at the altar for the old queen, but she wasn't there. "Arthur?" she asked, her throat sore and dry, her voice coming out as a hoarse whisper. "He is gone," the abbot said simply, "and so is your sister." He shook his head. "When Arthur died, she went mad. She was like a wild thing. She railed at us, that we had not tried hard enough to save him, that we had stolen her crown and her king." He blinked. "I can truly say that I have never seen such a strange and fearful sight. She was like one possessed." Numbly she shook her head. "Only by her own selfishness." He sighed. "She attacked my monks, clawing at them like a cat in a frenzy. If she was not possessed, then surely she was mad." Gwen blinked. "But you said she was dead." "We managed to repel her and drive her out of the chapel. When we found her in the morning, it was at the edge of the lake, drowned. She died within moments of him, we think." He shook his head. "She must have fallen in at some deep point. She must have truly loved him, to have been so frenzied." She decided not to disabuse him of his notion. "Yes," she said slowly, "she did. Or at least she loved his crown." "Then we will bury them together." He peered into her face. "Come, you should sleep." "But—" "The old queen, we call her Sister Blessed now, will hold vigil over them, and we shall have them buried by your ladies here, though not in ground consecrated to Christian use. Come." He took her hand and tugged at her. She stood. And then there was another blank moment, and when she came out of this one, she was lying on a pallet covered by a wool blanket in a small wooden hut. The door stood open, and sunlight poured through it. She was still numb, and her mind wouldn't work. It was almost as if she was under the influence of one of Medrote's potions. Finally, she just gave up trying to think at all. She let people lead her about, ate and drank what was put in her hands, did what she was told. She stood at the side of the grave as the monks laid Arthur and little Gwen in it. That gave her a strange sense of dislocation. She felt a moment of utter terror as she looked at the dead face that was so like her own, could have been her own. For that moment it seemed as if it was she, not little Gwen, that was being covered over with earth. But the moment passed, giving way again to numbness. The numbness, the dullness persisted. She spent days just sitting in the church, or at the grave of the lake, or at the cauldron well. If someone gave her something to eat, she ate it. If not, it didn't seem to matter. Nothing seemed to matter. Not only her heart was broken, so was her spirit, and she was nothing but a hollow shell where once there had been a warrior with her name. And so the days passed. And then one day she woke, and woke fully, and her mind worked again. She sat up and dressed quickly, feeling almost as if she had been very sick, and now the fever had broken. Yet once she had dressed, she was at a loss for what to do. She had no idea what was going on beyond the boundaries of the abbey. Had the Saxons overrun the country at last? Was there any resistance to them at all? Was there anything out there beyond the deceptive peace of this place, or was it all a chaos of warfare and blood? At least she could find the old queen, maybe, or Abbot Gildas, or one of the ladies, and ask some sensible questions. She ventured out into the morning sunlight, and that was when she saw him riding in along the path that led to the abbey, looking worn and weary, and as broken as she. "Lancelin?" she faltered. And although he could not possibly have heard her, he looked up and looked straight at her. But his expression did not change, and although he dismounted, tethered a horse that looked as beaten and weary as he, and walked towards her, there was nothing of joy and nothing of love in his face.
"Gwen,"
he said, stopping a little too far away from her to have taken her hand,
"they told me you were here."
and there it was. That love, if love it really had been, had burned bright and guttered out. When she tried to find it in herself, all she could sense were cinders and ashes and regret. She nodded. "I have been ill," she said, and released that dead love to fall to pieces in the aching void inside her. "I have heard of nothing since—"
"Ah."
The silence hung awkwardly between them.
"They never sing of these things, in the tales, never talk about what happens after everything is over."
She swallowed. "And what does happen?" she asked. His eyes held the wisdom of terrible sorrow.
"Life goes on. Planting and harvest, birth and death, sun and rain. The world does not end for everyone, just for a few."
He sighed.
"But you don't want to hear philosophy. The Saxons took a terrible beating, and no, they have not overrun the countryside. There is no high king, and things have broken down into squabbling among all the petty kings again. Most of the companions are dead. Those that survived have retreated to their estates, or taken places in the courts from which they came. Even Kellywig is mostly deserted, except for Kai and the few men that limped home from Cumlan. Rumor says that you are dead, and you are turned Christian and gone into retreat, or you have followed Arthur into Anwen, where you will both await a day that you are needed."
He shrugged.
"I came to see if the fourth rumor was true, that you were here, and if you were, to say farewell."
She stood awkwardly, hands dangling at her sides. Once she would not have been able to stop herself. She would have reached for him, begged him to take that farewell back. Now? "Then do farewell, Lancelin," she said. He forgave us, she wanted to say, but he probably would not believe that. He was the sort that flogged himself relentlessly with his faults. What we did or did not do changed nothing. Midroad did not conjure up that army out of nothing. He had this planned, for years, I think. If it had not been now, it would have been soon. Lancelin's lips thinned a moment. Then, reluctantly, he nodded. He looked up at the stone tower on top of Inniswitrin.
"Do you know,"
he said at last, his tone too casual,
"what it was that caused the fighting to break out?"
"I was too far away to see. Only there was a shout, and I think someone drew a sword."
"When your sister struck you, half the men were ready to charge. It only needed an excuse. Someone saw a snake and drew his sword to slay it."
He shook his head.
"And someone saw the sword drawn and shouted treachery. That is what makes me think you are right. Nothing we did or did not do made any difference. This was a mighty storm, and we were but reeds in its path."
He looked back at her.
"I am going away. I am not sure where, just yet. Somewhere I can find some peace, I hope."
She closed her eyes against the pain in his. "I hope so too, Lancelin. Fare you well." She kept them closed for a moment, as a single tear forced its way beneath the lid of her right eye and moved down her cheek. If there was still anything, any spark in those ashes, he would see that tear, and he would touch it or kiss it away, and...
But there was no touch, not a finger nor of lips. And when she opened her eyes again, it was to see only his figure, riding away, back as straight as a staff, yet head bowed beneath burdens he would not let go. It seemed too cruel, but he was haloed by the sunlight of a perfect, peaceful day. She wiped the tear away herself and walked to the little dock. The mist eddied and billowed over the lake, now showing, now hiding the farther shore.
"And what will you do now, fair cousin?" Somehow she was not surprised to find Gwyn standing beside her, though she had heard no one approach. And that was when she realized it. What made her feel so hollow and so lost inside, so empty and so broken? For the first time in her life she had no direction, no purpose, and no certainty. She was a boat adrift, with no paddle and no tiller. "I don't know," she replied, and closed her eyes on grief. "There seems no place and no need for me now." He considered that in silence. "Have your hands lost their skill with blade and bow?" he said finally. I don't think so." Yes, she did have that, and in the chaos that would come now there would surely be a use for such skills. But who would take me? I betrayed Arthur.
"Those who are well aware you did nothing of the sort," Gwyn replied.
He put his hands on her shoulders and turned her to face inland.
"Look there. That peaceful abbey of the Christ-followers. The Saxons too follow that path, and will leave them in peace, but there are those who will not, who will hear tales of wealth, and think it is the wealth of gold and silver, and not of wisdom. They will need a strong hand to help protect them. And look there." He turned her a little, aiming her at that hidden place that held the school of the ladies and the cauldron well. "The old ways will die unless someone finds a way to hide them among the new. And the old queen, who is now called Sister Blessed, she would do that if she knew it was needed, for it was the ladies who welcomed her as well as the abbot. Or," and now he turned her to face the mist, "or you can join my folk in Anwen. You will not be the first to join us, nor the last, and there is use for you there as well. Or you can go into the wilderness and make a hermitage for yourself, or return to your father and serve him and your sisters. Many choices are yours, and more options than most have now." He turned her to face him. "You have work, cousin, but you will have to make it for yourself. You no longer serve any for the moment. You are your own master." So there it was. Be careful what you ask for. It might be what you get. Hadn't she longed for just that in the days after she had escaped from Medrote? She was her own master. Her mind stirred, moved again, turning like an old mill-wheel too long left idle. Not her father. He had done well enough this long without her, and she could prove a liability, even a danger. There were men, like King March, who would hear of her being there and want to take and conquer her, just to be known as the man who owned Gwenhwyfar. She could not bring that down on those she loved. And not a hermit-like existence either,
That would drive her mad. But here, Gwyn had said that he thought there was a purpose for her, past being a mere warrior. The folk of Annwn had answered to her call. The ladies themselves came out to defend her. Abbot Gildas called her friend. She could be the bridge between the old and the new. She was, perhaps, the only one that had all the skills and all the friends to do so. She could not make Arthur's dream of one kingdom come true in this lifetime, but she could plant the seeds for it to grow when the time was right. A lightness began to trickle into that emptiness inside her. "There is much that can be done here," she said slowly. Gwyn nodded. "Yes, there is." She took a deep breath and felt her spirit come back to life. "Then it is time to start doing it." Afterword. I think every fantasy writer decides at one point or another to tackle the matter of Britain, otherwise known as the legend of King Arthur. The genesis of my own stab at this came when I was looking into Welsh legends, and came upon the curious triad of the three Guineveres. Triad 56 of the Trioedd Ynys Prydain, translated as the Triads of the Island of Britain, lists the three great queens of Arthur's court. Three great queens of Arthur's court: Gwenhwyfar, daughter of Ciwyd Gwent, and Gwenhwyfar, daughter of Gwythyr, son of Grediawl, and Gwenhwyfar, daughter of Gogfran the Giant, translated by Rachel Bromwich. Well, that certainly piqued my curiosity, as did the mention of yet another Guinevere, the false Guinevere, or Gwenhwyfar, translated as Little or Lesser Guinevere. She is often said to be the bastard daughter of King Llwyd Ogofan Gower, or Ogofan the Giant, born on the same day as her sister. Yet another triad, Triad 53, describes the three harmful blows of Britain, and states that the third was caused when Gwenhwyfar struck Gwenhwyfar and caused the Battle of Cumlan. And last of all, I found this extremely interesting item in my researches, 3 stanzas found by Jenny Rowland. In the margin of the Dingesto 8 copy of Umeddan Arthur R. Erir, Aberystwyth, National Library of Wales, manuscript 5268, page 461. Gwenhwyfar speaks. "Arthur Fab Uther of the long sword, I will say to you, now sadly the truth, there is a master over every strong one." Arthur speaks. "Gwenhwyfar, you are Gwenhwyfar. I have never been healed of love-sickness for you. Medrawd is dead, I myself almost. A surgeon has never seen a scar where Caledfwlch, Excalibur, struck once. I have struck Medrawd 9 times. Now when you add in all the times that Guinevere seems to have been kidnapped, wandered away, run off with someone, not usually Lancelot, and otherwise had any number of wild excursions, this seems a rather too active life for any one woman. Then you look at the places where she is childless, has one son, twin sons, and wonder which is true. And finally, looking at how she supposedly died, where she is buried with Arthur or somewhere else, is killed by Arthur after running off with Melwas, gets married by force or willingly to Mordred, becomes a nun, or dies of a broken heart after Kai kills her son or sons, I began to form a picture in my mind of not one, but 3 actual queens by that name. Now, I am not even going to pretend to be a Welsh Celtic scholar, and I freely admit I made most of this up out of the little bits and pieces I found above. In my mind, I fastened on the 3rd Guinevere, and I could easily see a scrappy fighter, much younger than Arthur, reluctantly wedded to a king quite old enough to be her father, as part of a bargain and power play, but who, schooled early on in the discipline and duty of princes, intended to make the best of it she could. And since the road to hell is paved with good intentions, therein lies the tale. I hope you enjoyed it. This concludes Gwenhwyfar. Please visit our website, www.tantor.com, for more information on our growing library of unabridged audiobooks and to take advantage of special offers. Or call toll-free 8777 TANTOR to request a catalogue.